relentless in the war. The legions in our hearts, shed waters in our balls. The spirit and the flesh, the emotions that arrest. The cerebral will contest, propelling the unrest. Preachers and bandits with means underhanded. The teachers pedantic and lack understanding. So sweep out the sand with the broom in your hand. Stand up, make we burn Babylon. Guess I can give the world to you, the world to you. But the falling of the curtain is for certain. Be careful where you're lurking, demons searching. The spirit and the women fight the battle within. Cause I can give the world to you, the world to you. But the falling of the curtain is for certain. Be careful where you're lurking, demons searching. The spirit and the women fight the battle within. With the semblance of a blaze, with gratitude and rage, we touch another page with delirious delight, impervious to light. This vitality and might encourages the flight. Preachers and bandits with means underhanded, the teachers pedantic and lack understanding. So sweep out the sand with the broom in your hand. Stand up, make we burn Babylon. Cause I can give the world to you, the world to you. But the falling of the curtain is for certain. Be careful where you're lurking, demons searching. The spirit and the women fight the battle within. Guess I can give the world to you, the world to you. But the falling of the curtain is for certain. Be careful where you're lurking, demons searching. The spirit and the women fight the battle within. The world to you, but the falling of the curtain is for certain. Be careful where you're lurking, demons searching. The spirit and the women fight the battle within. Cause I can give the world to you, the world to you. But the falling of the curtain is for certain. Be careful where you're lurking, demons searching. The spirit and the women fight the battle within. Look at that. Right off the get-go. Well, welcome, ladies and gentlemen. And a happy new year. We know what time it is. We seem to know what time it is. It is 2021. It is the first show of 2021. It is January 1st, 2021. We know what time it is, but do we know where we are, ladies and gentlemen? Do we know where we live? Because it is my contention, ladies and gentlemen, that you do not live where you think you live. You are not where you think you are, ladies and gentlemen. And this is breaking news. To those of you who already know where you live, well, then you're already ahead of the pack. But for those of you who still think that you live in a world of objects, in a space of objects, and you can figure out the objects through empiricism and rationality, and you can figure out what to do by logical propositions. No, that's not where you live. You do not know where you live. You do not know who you are. You do not know where you are without embedding it in a story. Ladies and gentlemen, you live in Storyville. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to my channel. My name is Ike Ogiamin, your host. And over here, we talk about being and doing with a strong emphasis on doing. So being better, doing better with a strong emphasis on doing. And what are we doing today? Today we are opening up Pandora's box and looking directly at where we are, where we think we are versus where we actually are. So, first announcement already alluded to is happy New Year. Shout out to the people in the chat, K Coachin in the chat, Nicer in the chat. And I timed this one to coincide with the sunset, which you cannot see over there, but you just see a bright haloed effect coming from that end. You see a bright haloed effect coming from that end, and that is the sunset out here in the West Coast. Out here in Los Angeles, where the sun sets on Western civilization. Yeah, right there you are seeing the sun setting upon the westernmost part of Western civilization, ladies and gentlemen. Geechee Dan, DJ Cadillac in the house, ladies and gentlemen. Oh, snap. Somebody noticed it. Somebody noticed it. Somebody noticed it. While we're talking about where we are and what time it is, and while I expound upon this hypothesis that you live in a place called Storyville, and we will unpack it carefully, layer by layer, we will convince ourselves that you actually don't live where you think you do. You live in this place called Storyville. But shout out to Michael Graham. Shout out to everybody in the house. But Nicer just noticed another thing. Okay, another particular event in the storyline of this channel. And this is an event that I'll have to give you guys 100% credit for and thanks for. Okay? Oh, snap. K Coaching beat me to the punch. Before I made the announcement, he officially became the first super chatter out here in the channel of Super Chat Jesus. Yes, in the channel of Super Chat Jesus, you, my fellow travelers, ladies and gentlemen, now have the ability to super chat. Yes, thank you very much, K Coaching, and thank you to each and every one of you. This had very little to do with me. You get monetized for having a certain number of subscribers, and that's you guys. Okay, that's you guys. You also get monetized for having a certain amount of hours viewed. That's also you guys. 100% credit goes to Nicer, K Coaching, Michael Graham, everybody in the house right now, holding it down as we continue to roll into 2021, January 1st. Happy New Year out here in the West Coast. Beautiful sunset. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, and we are breaking it all down. Yes. Geechee Dan, congratulations to you. Congratulations to the community. Congratulations to the algorithm. The algorithm sees all. The algorithm seeth all. Oh boy. SOBC hates taking second place, but don't worry. Each and every one that super chats will get a special allowance, let's just say, okay? In this first super chatting show on the Super Chat Jesus channel. Well, I'll let you know the allowances that you get for being part of this inaugural celebration in the first day of 2021, the first Super Chat enabled day, the first day of our monetization journey, ladies and gentlemen. Out here, I'll let you know later what you qualify for. But let me get back to the topic at hand, ladies and gentlemen. Okay, we're not going to forget, because this is very serious. This is very important. Where are we? Where are we, ladies and gentlemen? Where is this space-time causality continuum that we find ourselves in, this particular universe, material or spiritual, so on and so forth? What is it? Where is it? Do we know where we live? Ladies and gentlemen, in a very practical sense, in a very real sense, in the most important sense there is, we live in a place called Storyville. Well, let's start to unpack that, okay? Let's look, for example, at the forums, the fora, if you will, in which we exchange stories, where we keep up with the Joneses on Facebook or keep up with the Kardashians on TV, where we do social media or Game of Thrones and so on and so on and so on. Media and entertainment, which is all about stories, right? Let me get a one in the chat if at least there can be some agreement that the media landscape is a place whereby, whether it be social media or Game of Thrones or, it really is all about stories, curating of stories, passing of stories from one person to the other, sharing of stories. Did you hear the latest story? Oh, is it a tabloid story? Oh, same old story. Story, story, story. Oh, thank you, Kaizo. Because Kaizo, yes, Kaizo and I discussed earlier, and he's going to come in. I'm going to send you the link when it is time, Kaizo. After I elucidate and expound upon this particular hypothesis that we have today. So this is the third stream out here in LA, and also it's the third stream where I'm taking some other new tack, checking out this other landscape. Right? As we develop here, as we grow, as it is 2021, as we have gotten monetized, so on and so forth. This particular tack and these particular three shows were shows where I went just simply unabashedly abstract and intellectual. Not because that's what I will always be doing. No, I'm going to come back to brass tacks and teach you guys how to close deals and how to sell and how to perform and how to do all that good stuff. How to get the bag, ladies and gentlemen, but also to just to muse about musing and to think through abstract ideas, but with intuition and actionability, if you will, with being actionable being key to it all. So the media, which you guys just agreed with me, is a place where we curate stories, tell stories, share stories. It is a, what shall I say, an almost $800 billion. Did you guys hear me correctly? $800 billion of revenue. Okay, we're not talking about what it is worth. It's worth a lot more than that. We're just talking about the revenue. So these people out there in the media landscape, they know something. They know that we live in Storyville. We're just scratching the surface to kind of see what we're talking about here. We have not even talked about marketing and advertising yet. Marketing and advertising, which is about selling you a story. Okay. They're not selling you a product. They're selling you the idea that you too can be frolicking in the gardens. You too can be that character in this particular timeline, in this particular stage, if you buy this product for 3 simple payments of $39.99. Branding, the curation of a story, the story of a political candidate, of McDonald's, of Southwest. Branding, marketing, advertising, another close to $150 billion. Okay. Got $800 billion here in the market in the media side, another $150 billion in the marketing side, all about stories. And this is only the surface, ladies and gentlemen. This is only the surface. This is only to bring you out. All right. Say, hey, 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 come out. Come out from the cave. Come out from wherever it is you think you live and come into the sunlight where we can talk about Storyville, which is where you actually live. This is where you actually live, sir and madam, ladies and gentlemen. So while this goes down, let me just go ahead and click on this here Gmail, and copy Kaizo's, and it says link. And then I'll go over here live on TV. Okay. This is live while I look at my screen with my beady eyes, suffering from myopia. Squinting. Squinting. Rather sheepishly while I find the link to send. Okay? I'll send the link and I'll let you know when it's time to hop on. You can hop on and stay in the background. In the meanwhile, let me know when you get the link. It's already been sent. So just confirm. Wow, BW Chambers. Definitely appreciate your work out here in Cali. Ladies and gentlemen, yes, Kaiser, let me know when you receive that. So basically, I'm saying, look, man, you don't live where you think you live. You don't know who you are, where you are, what to do without it being embedded in some story. Okay. And we have to unpack this. We're going to go through it layer by layer by layer. We're going to demonstrate to you that the place called Storyville is where you actually live. And understanding Storyville is the way in which you move the world. We have already said, hey, there's about $900 billion being spent, being brought in every year in order to manipulate and massage Storyville, in order for us to consume media, in order for us to keep up with the Kardashians and keep up with the Joneses, in order for people to tell us stories about our lives, how our lives could be better if we buy this, that, or the other product. We're basically saying this is the entryway for us to begin to understand that we live in Storyville and not in this world of scientific objects and space-time continuum whereby it's about empiricism and logic and so on and so forth. Aha. Aha, aha, aha. Yes, go ahead, Kaizo. Give it to your friend. Oh my God. Kaizo says, is it okay to give it to my friend? She's intelligent and wants to join in as well. Now that's the Kaizo, that's a rather crazy setup. You just put some, like here's my friend. They're intelligent. No pressure, right? No pressure. Please, Kaizo, never. If we ever are in a situation, don't introduce me that way. If we ever get to that point, like here's Ike. He's intelligent. Like, oh my God, I better be on my A game today. So you say that we live in Storyville, Ike. What are you talking about? Okay, you say that I don't know anything unless it's through the lens of story. But I know a couple of things, Ike. I know things. I know things that are logical propositions that are based on empirical analysis. logical and rational arrangements of data, so on and so forth. Give me the truth. I don't need this. What is this story thing you're talking about? Yeah, I get it about the media landscape, but that just, yeah, that's a good way of kind of piquing my interest as to what this Storyville is. But what are you really talking about? Shout out to Antoine Wade in the house. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. There's a viral video of me out there, myself and Andrew Schultz. So, what I'm going to do is try to settle in to this first part of me attempting to convince us that this hypothesis makes sense. So, you say you know something, and let's challenge that. You know something outside a story. Well, let me get a one in the chat if we all know that narcissism is based on a story. The scientific term narcissism, yes, it's in that diagnostic manual thing, right? And it seems like people did some studies and they came up with some behaviors. It's enumerated and so on and so forth. It's scientific knowledge. It's called narcissism. But do we know the root of narcissism? Do we know what that word is? English is a very funny language, right? Because it has all these, it has Germanic roots, Latin roots, Greek roots, right? So there are all these things that are in there that we don't kind of understand. So, what is this narcissus thing that we talk about when we say narcissism? Does anybody know? Does anybody know? Well, if you know, then you already know. Oh. We're always ready. Well, correct me if I'm wrong, Kaizo, but the story is the story of Narcissus. And this is a Greek myth. And this myth really contains the truth of the story of narcissism. Narcissism, the scientific concept, is a stripped down, bare bones, summarized version of what we already knew in mythologies. Now, what if you're not Greek? Well, there are many, many different myths, many, many different stories in the landscape of Storyville from all these different cultures that talk about, let's say, this particular one trait, which is a self absorbed person. A self absorbed person. Yes, Narcissus fell in love with himself. Whatever you get from that manual of diagnostics, statistical, whatever it may be, the scientific representation of this thing called narcissism, it's only a bare bones, stripped down version of the story. The story, however, is the only way you can really get the knowledge, store the knowledge, convey the knowledge, and also deploy the knowledge of what narcissism really is. You need a character with a plot, set of actions, a moral to the story for you to actually understand what this narcissism is. No, you did not learn it from psychology, ladies and gentlemen. You learned it from stories which have already been there way before you heard about a psychology class, way before you got into the psychology class. You already understood the story of Narcissus. Narcissus. Whether you formerly knew or whether you learn it in the Greek way or any other way, there are the stories that you have heard that contain the information. Okay, Ike. Yeah. But I want to make sure that I stop and emphasize that the narcissism point is deeper than you think. There are many isms that are out there. When you put an ism in front of it and you has some kind of scientific covering, and you think that the knowledge is from observation of data, collection of empirical information, and so on and so forth, and coming up with some kind of a hypothesis that holds up. In other words, we think that we live in a world of objects, but no, it truly is a world of story. And there are many story of Narcissus and then narcissism. Okay, there are many examples out there. As a matter of fact, the claim that we're making here is that all knowledge is like that. All knowledge about yourself, where we are, who you are, what to do, is all in a story. It is never outside of a story. Never. It is never outside of a story. The Oedipal complex, right? We know that one, right? Well, that is a story. That too is a story. The story of Cain and Abel. But let's not go down that line just yet. Shout out to John. Shout out to John in the house. Says, thank you very much for the $5 super chat. And I'm very, very grateful. This is the first show in which you guys have the ability to super chat. This is the first show in 2021, January of 2021. And the sun is setting out there in the West Coast. And we are talking about where we are. We are saying that we live in a place called Storyville, that you do not know who you are, what you are, or you do not even know where you are without it being embedded in some kind of a story. Okay? We said, hey, look at the media landscape. Look at the marketing landscape. Look at the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of billions, nearly $1 trillion generated every year. Curating stories, selling stories to you, making sure that the stories of particular brands are well managed. Look at your knowledge, I then say. The Oedipal complex, well, that's from a story. The narcissism is from Narcissi or whatever. Many, many, many things in that particular realm. But you could say, okay, Ike, granted, you're starting to open my eyes to something here, Ike. And I'm willing to go along with you that first and foremost, yes, you opened my eyes, you piqued my interest by this multi-billion dollar industry that is all about stories. And after all, we are characters, at least subjectively, from how we look at ourselves and how we look at others. Characters with a plot, several subplots, timelines. We do have a narrative framework. We cannot help but look at it that way. So maybe, yes, in the social sciences, then yes, of course, in the social sciences, like psychology, you're going to come up with all kinds of knowledge that really are knowledge, or that really is knowledge that we got from stories. Let me stop at this point just to dig a little deeper into this. Just this first aspect. Knowledge of the social sciences. We're saying, of course, yeah, okay, I see it. Those things are all based on story. We cannot understand it without story. But the basic reason is this. Way before you came up with the scientific method, we knew what falling in love with yourself is. And we know it still based on the story, based on a character, right? And again, it doesn't have to be the particular Greek myth. There are myths, stories, examples all through cultures, history, and so on and so on and so on. And the way any particular group learns about falling in love with yourself is about some story that they have. It has to be about some character. What does it even mean without it having a plot line, a character, a story, a stage, actors with agency, making choices? That is where the real knowledge is. That is the more full knowledge. The scientific abstraction is a watered down skeleton. Narcissism is a watered down skeleton of the story of Narcissi. Is it Narcissi or Narcissus? Either way, that guy. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. That is what we are saying. And just to take it a little deeper, we're basically saying that as a result of the fact that before we had language, before we had these other levels of representation, alphabetic, numeric, and then the whole world of abstractions and mathematics, that we had knowledge, and this knowledge was conveyed in stories, and that it still is conveyed in stories. In other words, the knowledge is there in story form. The real knowledge is there in story form every time. Mathematical abstractions are just representations of the story, but you do not understand things in terms of mathematical abstractions, ladies and gentlemen. Okay, we already showed you in the social science of psychology, for example, how many of these concepts are literally lifted out of Greek mythology, and then we put an ism in front of it, and then we abstract from the story and say, well, it's this, and this. Put it in the book, put it in the shelf. Point is, at some point we get confused and start thinking that the knowledge is in the book, is in the diagnostic manual, is in the scientific work. But the knowledge is in the universe, and it manifests to us most clearly in the form of a story, because we live as human beings. We cannot help it. We don't know any other place to exist other than in Storyville, where there's plots, personas, timelines, beginning, middle, end. Characters do stuff, and there's an overarching theme. That is the way in which we encapsulate all our knowledge, keep it in our head, and also deploy it. Okay? That is the way. That is the way, ladies and gentlemen. And shout out one more time to everyone holding it down out here. Holding it down. Shout out to Michael Graham with the $5 super chat. Says, keep building in DTLA as well. Looks like you are at the JW Marriott LA Live. Perhaps tomorrow's stream or the stream the day after that, I'll go around with the camera and show certain things. Okay. Shout out to Kaizo in the house talking about the Mesopotamian, the ancient Mesopotamians, to the Greeks, and so on and so on and so on. However, there is this thing called a human being, and regardless of the particular structures of language which it develops, knows certain things which it keeps as story. It cannot know this world other than a place where action is taken, a stage. So far, we're just talking about what we know. But I also said that you do not know who you are, you do not know how to act, and you do not know where you are without story. We're looking at psychological information, and you may be convinced. You may be convinced, and you may say, yes, you know what? That makes perfect sense. We are, after all, a story. Our identity tends to be that way. And it makes sense that knowledge in the social science sphere will be a translation, a boiling down of the rich tapestry of stories which we have handed down. And may I also mention perhaps archetypes that are in our heads just to begin with, right? It could be argued that the hero's journey is an archetype. It's shared across cultures and so on and so forth. Yeah, it makes sense, sure, that the landscape of scientific knowledge in the social sciences would be just interpretations of stories, which we already know, and that the stories represent the real knowledge while the scientific knowledge is just a skeleton. But how about mathematics, Ike? Come on, man. There is no story in physics. I think I know physics without the whole story thing being brought up. So tell me, how does the world of Storyville and mathematical physics play? Because let's go to the abstract. Most abstract is mathematical physics. Does our mathematical physics knowledge also depend upon story? I would say yes, definitely. I would say yes. I would say, and when we make the full flow, it may become more apparent. But at this point, I will simply state that the abstract representations, the equations, represent a picture, and that picture tells a story. The story between two parameters, 10 parameters, depending on the parameters that you are discussing. It talks about cause and effect. It has a stage. It even has a timeline insofar as a lot of these equations have time as one of the parameters, right? Again, the equations are a representation of a picture, and this picture is a chart, a graph, blah, blah, blah. And this picture tells a story about the interaction between the parameters in question. And that without putting it in this form, without saying X causes Y to happen in this kind of a functional form, this kind of a relationship, as time moves forward, this happens, without also kind of applying some kind of a causal frame. X, this actor X, this parameter X caused this other parameter Y to change within this timeline. It is a plot, it is actors, characters taking positions, doing things. This is the way in which we understand the mathematical representations. This is still Storyville, ladies and gentlemen. Yes, sir. And John states, reading the chat, he states that as he speaks of this, I think of legacy. It is just a continuation of a story that a person creates. My legacy is my story. I leave for others, such as children, to continue. Well, you do not live where you think you live. You live in Storyville, and it's about time we start understanding the landscape of Storyville so that we are able to to avoid being manipulated and also to appropriately manipulate to get the outcomes that we want. In other words, let's put it that way. In order to get the outcomes that we want, we need to understand the landscape that we're in so that we understand the rules of the game. We understand what's possible and what's not. We understand the levers to pull. We talked about an almost $1 trillion industry in the media and in advertising and marketing that fully understands Storyville very well and is constantly curating stories, telling you stories, trying to influence your story in order to get you to do things. And it works. If it didn't work, there would not be $1 trillion in the United States market every year manipulating these stories. Shout out to the people in the house. Shout out to the people in the house. Welcome, 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 ladies and gentlemen. My name is Ike, one more time, Ike Ogiamin, and welcome to my channel. And on this channel, we talk about being and doing with a strong emphasis on doing. And what we're doing today is we're unearthing where we are, where we live, and how we know. Yes, yes, we're taking a very bold, bodacious task and saying, hey, where are we? Who are we? And how do we know stuff? And I'm saying that it's all embedded in story. We looked at scientific knowledge of a social scientific sort. Talk about narcissism. Well, narcissism is just a direct translation from a myth. There are many, many, many such kinds of knowledge that you think you understand because you read a book, but no, the book is just a stripped down version of it. You understood it before, and you understand it in terms of stories. And if it is new knowledge, in order for me to put it in your head and store it in your head, I have to put it in form of a story. And you say, how about mathematical physics? I say, hey, sure. How about mathematical physics? The symbols, the mathematical symbols, they represent a picture, the picture of a story. The story has these actors, which are the parameters, and they are interacting with each other in a saga, in a drama, in a story. And we put a little border around that, we put a little stage around it, and snapshot, boom, and then we store that. We cannot store it in abstract. We have to store it within a framework. And that framework is Storyville. We live in Storyville. Okay. So I get it. Yes, I get it. We have this thing called mathematics. It can represent the universe, at least the one universe, one of the universes, possible universes. It represents all possible universes and so on and so forth. But we really don't understand the universe without putting certain frames around it. And we're going to get to that point. We're going to circle around to the metaphysics of this. But let's move on now and talk about, well, who we are. How do we know who we are? This one, okay, is rather self-explanatory because John just mentioned about his legacy. His legacy is a story. It's a continuation of a story. And before you were born into someone else's legacy, right? Someone else already had a story going. There was a collective story about your nation, a collective story about your family, the ancestors. You come in, you're given a name, you come in a particular time within a particular set of circumstances. This begins to form the basis of one layer of your story. Who are you? Do you know who you are based on the fact that you are a collection of atoms and you have a certain mass and you're in a particular location on Earth and you have a certain momentum? Is that what you are? Is that how you know what you are, ladies and gentlemen? Let me get a 1 in the chat if this is making sense. If the juxtaposition between where we think we are, which is a landscape of objects with certain scientific parameters like, who am I? Well, I have this mass and I have this pH balance in my blood and I have this electronegativity sometimes and electropositivity sometimes, and I have this momentum. So between that versus Storyville, which I'm telling you is where you really live, okay, we're trying to see that, no, you don't live over here at all. We've looked at it from the point of view of certain scientific knowledge. And I'm saying that your scientific knowledge is always embedded in story. And now we're talking about knowledge of self. This is the place where it should be quite apparent that, oh, yeah, I am a story. I am not my mass and my charge and my momentum. I'm not even necessarily my location. The location is only important insofar as it is part of the story. Where I'm at today is only important insofar as it is part of where I was yesterday and where I'm going tomorrow. And as was mentioned with the legacy comment, okay, as was mentioned with the legacy comment, there are already many stories going on, stories of your family, stories of your nation, and so on and so forth. This is a formal introduction to the concept of Storyville. I call it formal because we have already been using it in many of our conversations already. When we were talking about how to close the deal or some other video about how to influence people, we talked about the importance of story. Having an image, in other words, to put in their head so that you can circle around that image. You're trying to sell rebar for walls. Paint an image of a wall while you talk to these people about the wall. Say, you know, how you on the wall on the freeway, and then you put that picture in their head, and now becomes the story about the wall, and you are more likely to sell to them talking about a story about a wall rather than reading the list of features and benefits in your particular application, whatever it may be, rebar, a saw, whatever it might be, your concrete truck, whatever it might be. Going in there with a story is very important. Also, 2 streams ago, I believe, maybe 3 streams ago, I said, why do you exist? Why do you exist? And that was a deep dive into your particular story. The fact that you are a story. The hypothesis there was that you exist as a story, and the purpose of your existence is the moral of the story. The moral of the story is the purpose of your existence. So we did that. We have been using this idea of Storyville all through. Yes, Kaizo, 2 streams before this one. We've been using this idea of Storyville all the way through here. We've been talking about the Storyland, and that's where we actually live for a while now. But today we're going to formally introduce it, and we're going to formally talk about it in all its aspects, all its facets. And let's see how we're doing here as the sun sets. Nice. Still doing well on the lighting. So, you do not know what is without it being in a story, and you do not know who you are without it being embedded in a story. And as a matter of fact, this particular aspect of who you are, this particular part of the conversation, this part being the conversation about who you are, is all story. There is no outside. It is all story. Who is Ike? Who's nicer? Who's Kaizo? Who is Falcon Black, Olu TV, and whom? What? It's a story. The story takes pieces of data from your natal condition, right? The family you're born to, who your mother and your father are, the tribe, the nation. These things are also all just stories. The nation is a story, the tribe is a story, you're another story born into it. You start living through, and then you have a theme, you're a character, you play a role. There are many subplots. There's the plot that you play out in college with your college friends. There is the role that you play with your family. There's the role you play with your significant other. It's all these plots and stories. We mentioned also that it is the story that can feel shame. It's the story that can be guilted. It's the story that can feel insulted. What feels insulted? Is there something in your stomach that got insulted? Did your spleen get insulted again? Don't you hate when that happens? When your stomach gets insulted? No, the story. The story is what got insulted. Okay? And as a result, and shout out, I see you guys. I see you guys, Kaizo and Co in the back. That means you got the link, and we will bring you in
in due course. So we need not dwell on the fact that you are a story and that the political order is a story. Oh, we started out from epistemology, how you know things. And you say, we don't know anything unless it's embedded in a narrative form. How about you? Who are you? What are you? Well, you are not just a collection of scientific, objective, materialistic, or physicalistic pieces of data. No, that is 100% irrelevant. How much you weigh is only relevant insofar as it is part of a story, right? Part of social acceptance or not social acceptance, right? Part of a storyline. It is not really what you are. What you are is a story, and also the political order, by definition, is very much a story. Okay. We started out looking at the media landscape as well and the landscape of advertising. We said that this is an almost $1 trillion industry. We say they know where we live. They know we live in Storyville and they're making a killing because they know that. No one is keeping this particular information from you, anyways. It's no secret, right? Over here, I do believe in secrets in the sense that, there are things that are out there to be discovered. But more importantly, I believe in open secrets, cliches, hidden in plain sight, where we simply ignore them. And this fact that we live in Storyville is one of those things that we conveniently ignore. So, how about in the realm of ethical knowledge? You say, okay, Ike, I get it. I get it. You're out here telling me that I don't know where I am and that I'm in this place called Storyville. I'm not in a world of objects. I'm in a world I'm more in a stage, a forum for action. There's actors, stage, timeline, plot. That's kind of how I see things. That's how I know certain objects. Even the mathematical ones, I tend to embed in some kind of a story, a narrative structure. I've also seen that even myself, if I look within, all I see is a story. And go watch that stream 2 streams ago called Why You Exist, and to elucidate that point further and to see what we can glean out of that, what we can learn out of that, what can be actionable from that piece of knowledge, which is that you need to create a lean, mean story so that you're not open to attack. Okay? In other words, you need to do some trimming on your story because every bit of extra foliage you have on your story is a way where you can be attacked. For example, if you have a big part of your story having to do with material possessions, right? The story of your material possessions is a big part of whom you are, big part of your story. Then that's just another place where people can attack you, right? Whatever it is you accrete to yourself, to your story, it's just a place where you can be attacked from. Okay, I get it. I'm a story there too. But I think that when I look out in the world and I try to figure out how to act, I look at an objective world. I look at a world of facts and things happening, and then I make rational decisions as to what I need to do. Do you? Is that what you do, really? Do we ever do that, as a matter of fact? So, we're talking about ethical knowledge now. What to do? What to do? How do we know what to do? How do we know how we ought to live? And I'm saying that based on our hypothesis, it's based on a story still. You do not know what to do unless you embed the whole thing in a story. And let me get a one in the chat if you get what I'm about to say. The fact that all our ethical knowledge is encoded in the story can be pointed to with this phrase: what would Jesus do? Let me get a one in the chat if you understand that in order for us to understand the moral code of Jesus, we need the whole story. There is no simple algorithm that says, well, this is the Jesus code. In situation A, you do B. In situation C, you do X. That's the Jesus code. No. You need a whole story with a character, with an overarching theme, with villains on the whole shebang. And then you ask, what would Jesus do? What would Han Solo do? Maybe. Maybe that's your bag. Ethical knowledge is embedded in story, ladies and gentlemen. Without the whole story, without the whole story, and I see ones in the chat. What would Goku do? What would Darth? Oh, yeah, we got some Darksiders here. I like that. I like that. Gotta have the dark side. The dark side is very useful. The dark side is very useful. Shout out to Snuggles. Snuggles 668. Don't change your name, Snuggles. It's a good foil. The name is a good foil. Descartes, I think, therefore I am. I am that I am. Yes, Kaizo. Yeah, yes, I see Snuggles everywhere too. Speaking of branding, that is a good name. It gets some strange reactions from some people, but attention is what you want. As they say, all publicity is good publicity, right? So, Olu TV, also known as Falcon Black, he said, what will Goku do? This is an ethical question. This is the way we think ethically. Okay. Let's not forget that we already mentioned the other ways in which we think, which are in line with Storyville. Let's not go forgetting. Okay. Let's not go thinking that we're just going to leave it behind. I am telling you that you live in Storyville, and this is not some kind of arbitrary BS that I'm putting out there. I'm saying that it is, insofar as it can be defined nicely, true. It is true. The point is, Falcon Black, you cannot come up with a formula for what Goku should do. You cannot come up with some kind of abstract, quote unquote, scientific, quote unquote, quantifiable, quote unquote, I can write it down in a code to tell you what Goku would do. That's not how we work, because that's not where we live. We live in Storyville. And in Storyville, you simply have to take the whole story of Goku. The information, what will Goku do in this situation, is contained in the whole saga of Dragon Ball Z. And you have to take that whole thing, try to transpose Goku from that story world into your story world, and then watch what happens. This is what we call ethical knowledge. So, ladies and gentlemen, as we muse and continue to muse in this third Third, unabashedly intellectual stream back to back to back because it is New Year. And what else are we going to do so that we understand the framework that a lot of the information, a lot of the more practical, pragmatic information is coming from this background, right? It's coming from this framework. When I talk about how to persuade people, a lot of, well, all of this is implied. And if you go back and watch those videos, you're gonna be like, oh, okay. I see, yeah, I get it. I get the worldview. I get the worldview. So you do not even know how to act. You do not even know what to do unless you have some kind of a narrative structure. What would Jesus do? Han Solo do? Some other Jedi or Sith Lord do? What will Goku do? This is the way in which the information needs to be conveyed, stored, and deployed. You cannot deploy knowledge of the Goku way without having the whole Goku story. You cannot tell somebody what Goku would do unless you told them the whole story. And then they take it and they have it in their heads and they combine it with their story, and then the answer comes out. The answer is not a scientific answer. The answer is not a systematic answer. The answer has a logic of its own, but it's a logic of Storyville that has to do with characters, plots, beginnings, middles, end, contexts, so on and so forth. Okay? You do not know what you know. You do not know who you are. You do not know even what to do, ladies and gentlemen, without the Storyville. And you're like, Ike, well, it's covering quite a bit of ground here. And then let's mention one last aspect, and then we'll bring in our guests, our interlocutors or interlocutors. Tavana Perry in the house says, I agree that ethical knowledge is embedded in stories. I do not agree that scientific knowledge is a skeleton of a story. Excellent point. That one is the stretch algorithm. Because we have to speak in analogies, and the analogy breaks down around a mathematical area. But let me try to address the point. The point is more of a metaphysical point, which is this: scientific knowledge, the knowledge of what is in an objective sense. We cannot think about the entire universe but as a stage for action. Let me pull out a big gun, okay? Big guns are not very precise. I'm not boasting of any kind of surgical work here to begin with. But to Tavana, let me say this. The big gun is this. Everywhere you go, every culture, every society, you hear of this character called God. Everywhere you go. Everywhere you go, when it comes to the fundamental question about where we are, the nature of things, how we can actually begin to think about things, we find this character called God. This is a character. He takes actions. We look at the world, we cannot help but look at the world as a domain, a stage for actions. And even the God topic has a whole story behind it. What does this have to do with the breakdown of the analogy when it comes to scientific knowledge? What I'm saying is this: just as I mentioned before, that when we look at objects, forces, okay, forces or particles interacting with each other, that we embed this thing within a story framework where we impose things such as causality, and there is a timeline, and there is some kind of a container relationship, some kind of a point of view, which we impose on it. Okay. And that this thing is also related to the fact that whenever we look at the world, try to look at it in the most abstract way, try to look at the most fundamental nature, we end up bringing up this aspect of actors, plots, timelines, as exemplified by the big gun, God, right? Pulling out that big gun is not, as I said, precise surgical argumentation, but it shines a floodlight in the area which I'm trying to elucidate and illuminate and create the argument that all of our knowledge tends to have a story framework to it. And that the fact that knowledge of social good, knowledge of psychological good, and psychological being, if you will, is embedded in stories, and that even if you go more abstract, you still need a story framework in order to understand the interactions of abstract forces, particles, parameters, so on and so forth. And when you try to look at the whole universe and you say, well, what is going on in here? We find out that time and time again, we end up with a story with this one character that does things, and there's a plot line to this whole thing. It is therefore my contention that if we see it all the way from us, all the way from who we are, all the way through to the politics and the metaphysics, if you will, then there's a through line in there. There is something in us that can only see the world this way. That is, and let me get a one, Tivana, if that at least addresses the concern, which is, first of all, yes, I see the concern because the analogy breaks down a little bit in that mathematical abstraction level, but that still the equations represent a picture, and the picture is telling a story. And there are things about the structure of the story that we are bringing in. We are bringing in the stage, and we are bringing in the fact of causality, and so on and so forth. And then there is this other big picture metaphysical thing, which we see everywhere, this guy called God, which is an actor on the stage. And that this ties from the smallest to the largest, the fact that it's always stories embedded in stories, embedded in stories, embedded in stories. And I see a one. So thank you very much. Shout out to, let me try to do some work here. Apologies. When I'm out here, I got the laptop and I got to do what I can with all the different screens and so on and so forth. Audrey says, big guns. Big guns are actually quite precise and cover a greater domain. That is true, yeah. But whenever you bring out the biggest of all guns, the God gun, you gotta at least say, okay, well, I'm not saying that I'm making a surgical explanation here, but I'm painting a picture somewhere. All the world is a stage. Yes, that was a great summary of what we're talking about here. What we wanted to do it systematically. We wanted to say, okay, let's look at the knowledge, epistemology, how you know what you know, and that it tends to be the real knowledge you have is always an analogy knowledge that relates things to stories. Okay. That you may have all these abstract equations, but when you actually try to generate the knowledge from yourself, your understanding, it is always in the form of a stage with this force acting on this object for this particular end or something. There's always some kind of a story going on. And then who you are is a story. How to act. Well, what would Jesus do? What would Goku do? So on and so forth. You need a story. And then the biggest of all stories still ends up being God. You may take God away and then you put the forces of nature, and so on and so forth. But whenever you get into trying to think about any why beyond that, you end up in some kind of another story. Another kind of story, ladies and gentlemen, in the house. All right, ladies and gentlemen. Once again, I would like to thank you guys for showing up here. Yes, this is a pragmatic framework. I'm not necessarily saying that, there is some storyland in which we live in. I'm just saying that we live in the storyland. In other words, you cannot escape it from a pragmatic standpoint. And as Myth Twist says, it is more a reflection of how we understand the world. It is not a question of what the world actually is. Because the questions of what the world actually is are not questions that I can give you a satisfactory answer to. Well, I don't think anyone can give a satisfactory answer to that. But how we understand the world, how we see the world, intuitively, through all history, and so on, and so on, and so on, it tends to be Storyville. It's not Objectville, space-timeville. No, it is a stage. It is Stageville. Action, plots, characters, beginning, middle, end. That's how we live. That's how we know. That's who we are. Anything else, it's outside of our ability to grasp. Indeed, indeed, indeed. So, Mr. Hello.
Hello.
Yeah,
Hi,
guys. Hello. Can you guys please introduce yourselves, please?
I'm Audra. I'm Kaiser's intelligent friend, and
Your Kaiser's intelligent friend. Yeah, I like that you're going with it. He already set it up that way, so you gotta pick up that baton and run with it. So thank you
happy
very
to.
much. You are welcome. And Kaizo himself. So what do you guys have for us? You reached out to me before I started the stream, ladies and gentlemen, to the listening audience, and you said, "Oh, you've been doing some musing and some thinking about this particular topic." So the floor is yours, Kaizo and intelligent friend.
What's up, family? It's me, obviously, the Kaizo, and obviously this is my very intelligent friend, Audra, and obviously the other intelligent friend, Ike or Ike, actually, Ike. I think that's a preferred.
Well, that gets into that complicated conversation. Well, Ike is if I were Igbo, but you could just call me Ike. It's a silly Nigerian tribe thing having to do with the particulars of my actual name, but Ike works.
Right. Okay, that sounds cool. Yeah. So okay. So if we talk about the Storyville, we're going to be jumping all over the place because we're all here NE DOMs. So if anyone is familiar with the MBTI personality type theory, there is different personality types. So there are the intuitives, then you have the senses. Senses are more primarily focused on sensing the environment, sort of using the five senses to establish knowledge. Meanwhile, the intuitives utilize the abstract, the unknown, to establish knowledge. So usually the difference between the two is One prefers the tried and tested methodology, which are the senses, and then the intuitives prefer the abstract analysis to determine what truth is for them. So in this panel, for example, we have Audra, who is an ENTP, which is E for extrovert, N is for intuition, T is for thinker, and P is for prospecting, which means she's going to be focused on having a tentative understanding of things. If something better comes along, she's not going to cry about changing her opinion. Meanwhile, we have Ike or Ike, who is an INTP, which is an introverted version of Audra, which is also primarily interested in ideation. And then you have me, which is the Joker.
So you're Milo Yiannopoulos mainly, something like that, I guess.
Well, actually, he would be an ENFP, which is the feeler version of us. So I'm still a thinker, so slightly different from him. But yes, still a Joker type.
Gotcha. Okay. No, nice little setting of the table there. Go on.
Right. So when it comes to Storyville, obviously everyone has a story that they tell themselves. The simplest way to introduce this topic would be, or a simple way rather, not the simplest way, is let's trigger a few people, but tribes, right? You have the Americans who say the terrorists about, the terrorists. I have to say it in a way that YouTube algorithm won't, shut down this video. The Taruhaiste people are bad because they do bad things. And then the Taruhastu people say Americans are bad because they do bad things. Each side has a story that they tell. The truth is, both sides do so-called bad things to the perception of the people who things are being done to. It's all a story that we tell each other, right? It's the only way that we can get a society to function within a normative performances. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to actually get anything done. We all have to buy into the story, right? It's like, Audra is my intelligent friend. That's a story in on itself, because ultimately, even the term intelligence itself can get under scrutiny, etc.
So you threw in a whole relativism landmine in there, and Audra, what do you have to say about this way of introducing the topic?
So I like Kaizo contacted me, and then I saw the topic in the Storyville, and I guessed what direction you were going to be going, and I do like that setup. I do a lot of thinking in those terms and using that terminology. I do a lot of writing, and I find that it's a very effective language and sort of way of looking at things that if you do look at the narratives appropriately, that you can get beyond sort of the expectations, the sort of standard rule book. I've done that a few times. Everybody's like, oh, this is how you do things, and like, well, here's the narratives that are going on, and if here's how that action would affect them, and here's the other thing we could do that will have a bigger impact in the direction we want to take things. Like it's like I said, I definitely agree that looking through that lens is quite illuminating and quite powerful. I don't know that I agree that it is sort of the ultimate lens, but I think it is perhaps not the first lens that is looked through when discussing these matters, when people go searching in this direction. So that's valuable to just to bring it up. And again, maybe if I had to rank it as sort of what I think it's best at, I think it's a very, very powerful lens. Like, we talk about this is what controls us, and I would have to agree with that. If you understand narratives, and there's a huge ethical pile of worms that can be dug through when you get in that direction, and you go, okay, well, if you're aware you're creating stories for other people, what are the implications? But yeah, no, it's definitely a fun place to discuss.
Someone is okay. I was getting some feedback there.
Right.
Powerful narrative, okay? Not the ultimate narrative in searching in this direction. Just try to repeat certain things which I think I heard you say. and in this direction, or at least has the flavor of what motivates us. That direction. Where do we live? How do we know? How do we know how to act? And therefore, not just ourselves, but everyone else. And the immediate question comes to mind, like, what are the other lenses here? What are other choices, Audra?
I mean, you can look at things. I can't think of it. I can't think of one off the top of my head that's quite as compact and easily just a narrative structure. That's an easy one that everybody understands what you're saying. I suppose I would say there's I call it a pseudo geometrical viewpoint. I look at a lot of things that way. It's narrative is limited, well, at least in the way we discuss it generally, by the colors of the color of language, and in order to sort of look at things without that tint on the glasses is more difficult. But like I said, it's not like mathematical geometry and it's like here's a set of rules and I call it pseudo geometry because it's not necessarily that it's not necessarily contained within what you could write on a piece of paper within 2 or 3 dimensions. But I think that looking in sort of it's a pattern based lens. I think there's a lot of and not separating out. It's really just a looser or a higher abstraction that things like narrative structure and other models would fit within.
I see. So there's this higher level of abstraction. Some people like to reach for it. I have a taste for it too. Perhaps reading people like Plato and Immanuel Kant, and who is that guy? His name escapes me now. Baruch Spinoza. So those kinds of writings, right, where it's like QED, therefore, now let me break it down to you. These are the premises and this is the conclusion and so on and so forth. Yeah, it and Hegel is the worst. Let's not get into Hegel. Of doing that kind of thing. And I think it was Kierkegaard that said that Hegel is one of the greatest writers, if only he just kind of admitted or realized that everything he's saying is just in imagination. Like he's just pulling stuff out of like, oh, here's this pattern we can go down and beat it to death. So yes, okay, I understand. It is a very powerful narrative and definitely as exemplified by the fact that it was challenging for you to pull out one that was comparable to it, right? In the hierarchy of narratives, or I'm using narrative to explain narrative, but yeah, very, very good point. So, Mr. Kaizo, why did you bring up the relativism thing? I'm assuming you have something to say about that. You said you were going to upset some people. You talked about this. Let's go. We may remove the T word, and if we're just talking about, let's say, the British government going to India, and I think there was a tradition where wives were burnt when the husbands died and that kind of a thing, and it was found to be particularly abhorrent and so on and so forth. And they had a whole storyline in India as to why they did that, right? And then Mr. Englishman comes around and says, no, this is horrible. And how does that all play out? Is there an overall, what's the big story here? Is it at that point just a power game? Yes, you have the power, you get to change the story. What are your thoughts on that?
Okay, so okay, well, let's do this. So the whole story is obviously regulated by power structure. The structure is let's abstract this as a form of a game. Like a computer program, right? So the power structure will be the codes the limiting codes, right? So the codes that permit the boundary limits of the game. So if you end up on the edge, you'll fall, you'll die, or if you end up at the edge, you'll fall into the river and you only have 5 seconds and then you'll die, etc. So the power structures are the limiters that pervade the game structure. So the thing is, everyone within the story is limited by the power structures. This includes the king or the so-called hierarchy master or game master, as well as the participating players. Everyone is limited to a rule. It's just the rule is different. The limiting rule is different for each individual. Just like a game of chess, the queen has the most amount of freedom. However, everyone is still limited to a rule. Even the queen isn't the most powerful piece. If the king dies, then that side has lost the war or the match. Yet the queen is still the most powerful piece. So everyone is limited to a sort of rule structure. Now, the thing here is that humans have evolved to formulate a narrative, to prefer narrative over even truth. And I'll give a perfect example for this, right? So you could ask yourself, why are people allowing evil so-called dictators to continue to dictate and continue out their evil? Meanwhile, there are many people that could have just so-called taken them out of existence. The thing is, they can't do that because then, if you've seen Game of Thrones, the person that did do that, take out the king, he was called a Kingslayer. That story or that name was put upon him for being a Kingslayer, and it wasn't a positive name. As you see, there was this effort of trying to shame him and dirty his name, that he was somehow some unloyal and degraded individual because he slayed a king. So the story there that was preferred was still that the king is the most important piece and you cannot take him out, no matter how evil he is. Even though the so-called story is trying to say that the king is evil, you still have to participate and play the game according to the rules. Meaning, even if the conditions that exist within that society are terrible, you still have to participate within the agreed rules and the normative structures to move forward. And that's what the story that kind of maintains the human survival, because if people obviously were able to just escape that matrix, then there would be no system, because the system wouldn't exist long enough to even be attacked or even be evil enough that it would warrant attacking.
Audra, let me ask this. As Kaizo spoke, I thought, okay, so there is power, but the narrative seems to be even stronger, in the sense that people will say, hey, why did you mess up the narrative structure here? Yeah, sure, this king sucked, and we would have liked to have shifted the power situation such that X, Y, or Z would happen. But the narrative structure seems to be preferred. You said evolved to feel that way, Kaizo, and so on. So when people talk about power, and yes, they do talk about the narrative structure, and then they talk about who controls the narrative structure, it would seem, or in your view, is there a way of really controlling the narrative structure? Are there people or groups that are that powerful that they can actually not only kill the king, but change the minds of everybody to just accept it, using his analogy there or his storyline?
So what pops into mind is that there's controlling the narrative, but the intent of controlling the narrative is typically to control the people, right? Of course, there's different ways to do that. We can, there's the more forceful, more obvious ways. So the advantage of controlling people via controlling the narrative would be to control them without them realizing, to a certain extent, generally, that you are controlling them, or at least, or at the very most, even if they understood, feeling unable, not seeing a way out of it, right? Because that, again, seeing the narrative, you can construct, people can be stuck in one that they don't see a way out.
I definitely.
Question was, but yeah.
It's and what you just mentioned kind of brings me to Kaizo, if you could read this question or comment here after I say this. The Brave New World versus 1984, right? So 1984, you have these iron bars and guns and, telescreens watching you, and we're going to try to control things that way. But I think that the Brave New World, in terms of let's give them Soma and let's give them free love and this, that, and the other, is a better way of controlling. It is more subtle. It is more akin to the situation that we live in currently, right? through subtle media manipulation and so on and so forth, and actually giving you what you want. Let's give them bread and circuses, or ecstasy and raves, or whatever it may be, but thereby you don't even see the walls, right? You don't even see the walls of the cage, and so on and so forth. So,
Right, that's
Kaiser,
to have
go ahead.
because what you're saying there, you know, give them what they want. I would say that controlling the narrative, if you're giving them, if that's your approach, it's going to fail, and that's more of a salve, because the ultimate intent, right, for this to work properly would be to you control what they want, right? That's controlling the narrative. That not giving them what they want, that's not controlling the narrative. That's again, that's supply line. That's a physical interaction. Controlling the narrative is influencing what it is that they want, and changing that.
Good.
To your
That little subtle thing that you just said right now, just because you may already perhaps intuited what I meant by giving them what they want,
right.
at a certain kind of a base animalistic what do they want. But are you suggesting that even that base animalistic what do they want question can be manipulated? Like, in other words, people don't really want sex, drugs, and rock and roll, but they were told they wanted sex, drugs, and rock and roll.
I think that, you know, in that example, say for example, I would say that rock and roll is a example of a narrative version of sex and drugs, right? So you might say, okay, everybody wants sex and drugs, but why is rock and roll that, right? They didn't want, no, they wanted rock and roll, which was a flavor of that, right? Which satisfied that. So, you know, you can be like, all right, that's the narrative flavor there, you know.
I see.
And then the stories, you know, with the stories, any sort of, you know, where they're going to get this, right? Rock and roll has a culture. So in order to get these things, there were behavioral norms, right? That had nothing to do with the sex and the drugs, right? That was the really sort of like low level thing that you can, you know, sort of the meat underneath. But by putting it in the construct of rock and roll, I could say you could expect that those pointed that direction and moving towards that, they were going to dress a certain way, and they were going to use certain words, right? And you know, and when it comes to control, when you control that and you can predict that, right? That comes into, you know, forecasting, or again, you're controlling all these aspects of their behavior. You're not changing whether or not they want sex and drugs. You're controlling how they wear and how they talk and where they go and what they spend their money on. You know, that's the trick.
I see. Okay. So the trick is one level above. It's how it is manifested, right? And
right, because I mean, in general, that's how people, that's anybody who's trying to exert control over people, they're interested in the shared space outcomes, right? They're interested in being king of the shared space. Therefore, the actual manifestations are the measurable. That's what you're attempting to alter.
Wow, that is a very good point there. Can you read, or no, I'm seeing these other Kaizo?
All right. Yeah. So yeah. Okay. So in response to what she's saying is, I'll give a simple example that is somewhat parallel to what she's saying. It's this. It's so imagine how the media portrays certain groups of people, or and the story and narrative that it tries to portray on them. The thing is, once you build a story about this group of people, let's say I don't know, I don't want it. Anyways, you demonize one group of person or people, and then you create narratives and then stereotypes on those group of people. Now those people start to also somewhat behave within those stereotypes and those boundary limits. Now they actually are the ones who are controlling themselves to actually then they do this whole self control within that narrative, and then they're the ones who actually then allow you to control them. So it's like you all you do is you create the boundary limit. So you create the container that contains everything, and they jump into the container, and then when others tries to escape that container, the same people back into the container. So it's a self-fulfilling, self-sustained system that you've created, and it's all based on not the actual essence of what you're describing or discussing, but the pseudo connections that actually are connected to that thing. So it's not a causal connection, it's more of a correlatory or even just parallel connection, but they're connected enough that there is a pull or a between them. So in the end, what ends up happening is, for example, hippies are seen as these so-called communists, or these people that are what, etc., etc., and anyone who smokes weed is within that type of group. So then people who do end up joining that group also tend to have that ideology. So because not only is it just consequential, but it's also the whole aspect humans tend to seek approval from other humans who also practice the same thing. So for people to gain that so-called acceptance, they join that group. So it ends up being a self-fulfilling cascade.
I see. The two things you mentioned there, or what you mentioned, brought back to mind something else that that also came up when you were talking earlier. And this is the whole thing about the mimicry, copying, and also the human sacrifice thing, which I'm going to hold that for a second. Because you mentioned the killing of the king and then how that particular individual was scapegoated. And it is almost the reverse of, because you mentioned a crab in the bucket's kind of a scenario right now. If I got you correctly, okay. And also there's the scapegoating, which is also kind of similar. But before we move further, can you read what Snuggles says there on the screen, if you can see it? And let's try to answer, if we can, that question.
The mindset that you have on the conversation that you discussed, this is learned behavior or is it natural?
Do you understand what is being asked?
Okay, so is it a learned behavior? So is this how humans naturally respond without being taught, or is it something that we develop or get socialized into? I'm guessing that's what they're asking.
Okay, well, yeah, that's a good enough question. What do you okay, let me see. So far, okay, that's a alarm, restart. Okay, so far, we have talked about the power and then the narrative. You mentioned that the narrative tends to be more deeper in terms of there's no way of really getting out of it, which would seem to suggest that it is not learned behavior. But obviously, there's always some part that is learned, right? So let me throw it to the floor then, Audra. What would you say to this kind of a question as to, well, learned or not learned, which part is learned, which part is not learned, and so on and so forth?
So I think the attention towards narrative stories as ways of, more or less, as sources of information, right, that we can use to make choices, try to help us decide how to act. I think that's relative. That seems to be relatively innate, right? And perhaps even not unique to, like it's a very, very basic concept, probably not even unique to humans, whereas the actual stories that we go by, I think they are learned, right? So we've all got, and I think that the stories, the narratives that we absorb, early in our development, that have a huge impact. And I think, there's I don't know, there's not necessarily a biological impetus to revisit those narratives and analyze them. I think that it's a specialized attentional component that directs, folks like us and others to really try to understand, to see these things and revisit them, because it's not necessarily going back and tearing up long held beliefs that you didn't realize you assumed. It's not necessarily, it can be quite a painful process. Can be quite, use the word discombobulating, that's close enough. It's disorienting, right? Those are the things that we automatic, our sort of basic compasses. And so to go back and realize that some of them are founded on quite shallow sand. There is a debate to be had as to what is the advantage of that. I think that it does come later there, but it's not an immediate sort of reward. But
Okay.
I'm getting off topic. But yeah, I think there's two components. I think our ability to absorb those narratives, much like music. Music, I think, is a good example of non-formal, sort of modern linguistic narrative that human brains are incredibly attuned to, and programmed to remember and absorb. So I think that part is innate, but the particulars of the narratives, those are, there's definitely cliches and commonalities, right? Based on the constraints of our physical existence and our, of how we're built, suggest that there will be similar narratives. But I do think the specifics of the narratives are learned.
So you mentioned commonalities, and just one thought on the whole: is it wise to go about digging here for yourself, and especially when others can be involved, right? Kind of Nietzsche comes to mind. I don't know which particular paragraph or in which particular book, but the whole idea of not going around and kicking people off their perches.
Right.
Perches, superstitions. In other words, they're stories, right? Thinking that we have some kind of if we kick this person out of the story, out of their particular story, their particular narrative, that somehow some new vista of truth is going to open upon them, and they're going to, they're going to come into the enlightenment, singing your praises. And that is not the case. That is just somebody who does not realize that they are also on a perch. It's like you went through, due to your unique psychology and experiences, so on and so forth, you have this little perch that you're standing on, and you think that you're not standing on anything, and you go around knocking off other people's perch. Like, ha ha, grandma, you believe in that Bible book? Ha ha ha. It's all that kind of stuff. And I think that I tend to agree with you in that sentiment that a lot of it, especially when it has to do with other people, it is foolhardy to go around trying to knock them off, because you cannot build some other perch for them. You cannot build that narrative structure back. It is almost impossible, right? Unless you want to be unless you're a fantastic cult leader. Okay. You can go in there and completely break them down and build up this whole new, that's some great charisma there. But you're talking about the commonalities, and I want to ask, what do you think about archetypes? That whole idea of archetypes. When you mentioned commonalities in Storyville, I'm like, what do you think about archetypes, Audra?
I think archetypes, and there's all kinds of models that you could describe a discrete set of what you could call archetypes. Kaiser brought up MBTI. That's an example of a discrete overlay, right? So I think I've studied them quite a bit, and various systems and models, and I do think model is the correct term for all those things. But I think they're useful, and I think when people usually being devil's advocate, they usually say, well, they're accurate or inaccurate. Well, none of them are intended to contain the totality of human variation. They're intended to, I think it is a cluster, they're clustering algorithms and saying, well, okay, there's, if we're going to set, K equal to 16, okay, where are the hot spots? Where things tend to get closer together and pull towards one area or another? I think both observationally it occurs, right? I think these models do describe something. And I think, at a certain, from another perspective, if we're dealing with beings that are bound by specific constraints, right? We're not in the form as we exist. We are not infinite in all ways, right? Mm-hmm. Therefore, when you have a system and you have actors in it and they have a set of constraints, that is going to suggest, that's going to steer the possibilities insert, in, shall we say, a finite set of directions as far as what is likely, right? Where the flow goes. So I think systemically and observationally, archetypes exist, I guess. So now that I've established they exist, but and I think they're
Yeah.
useful, both on understanding ourselves, relationships. They're a great shorthand, right? If you understand them and you're in a new situation with new people and you don't know a great deal about, you don't know their whole narrative, right? You don't know
Mhm.
their exact story. You might get a hinkling. You're like, I think their story is one of these types of books, and so you might have two different books talking to each other, and you go, these two books don't understand each other because I think they're these sorts of books, and you might be able to sort of actually, have have an effect and be able to sort of reasonably accurately see the situation and affect it if you want to, without having to completely read the books of those people. I think that's one use of it.
100%, 100%. And that is a very good answer to the question, because it is one of those things that should be obvious. But then again, I'll dig into I'll ask a follow-up question, and to Kaizo, I'll dig into the part that seems kind of mysterious and why ask the question if the answer is so obvious. By answer being so obvious, I mean, yes, there are people, and you can classify them just like you have rocks and mountains and shapes out there in the world that evolve. And yes, you're going to have categories and so on and so forth. The sticking point there is where it exists, and this whole thing about the unconscious, and that it is something that is out there, separate from just that. It really does then get into the question of consciousness. That's just another way of getting into the question of consciousness. But ladies and gentlemen, let me go ahead and shout out to everyone in the chat. Shout out to everyone in the conversation. Okay, and someone was asking for the Cash App, Mr. M. Garvey, which should be Marcus Garvey, I believe. Yes, we do have a super chat now, ladies and gentlemen, and it is the first day of monetization out here, and it is the first day of 2020. And welcome to those of you whom are definitely to those of you whom are new to the chat, whom are new to the channel. Please go ahead and subscribe while I look over here to see the shout out to D-Rock in the house for the $25 Cash App. Okay. And shout out to all those Snuggles and the rest of you guys at K Coaching that have donated also on the super chat. And today we're talking about the fact that you live in Storyville, ladies and gentlemen. Oh man, Orlando Johnson with the $50 super chat. This is crazy. We're having steak tonight. So we're talking about the fact that you live in Storyville, okay? You do not know who you are. You do not know where you are, what you are, without it being embedded in story. We talked about the landscape of advertising and media, and that they know this, and that's why there's almost $1 trillion spent every year trying to curate stories, influence our stories, tell us stories so that we buy stuff, okay? We talked about narcissism and so on and so forth. Different kinds of, let's say, scientific knowledge that is just a way of summarizing stories. We talked about the fact that who you are is a story, okay? Audrey was talking about earlier that the story template is innate, but the particulars of your story are going to be different. So you have your natal situation. You're born to a mother and a father, a tribe, a society. These things are all stories. You play a role in that story. You come in and you are a new character. You appear on the stage and you continue to play out the story of the nation, of the tribe, of your family. You have a role. There's a timeline. There are acts done, so on and so forth. That the whole political system is a story, and that the biggest picture we can take tends to also have this story with this character called God. And that from the biggest to the smallest, how we know what we know, where we are and who we are is Storyville, and that we cannot escape it. And we have Kaizo and Audra, Kaizo's intelligent friend, here today to discuss this topic with us. Okay, so Kaizo, we left off with Audra talking about, well, the idea of, and this was sparked by Snuggles' question, well, learned versus not learned. Okay, and then we talked a little bit about the archetypes. And now, well, let me because I think you read the question and you didn't get a chance to kind of weigh in on that. What do you think about the question and then the answer that Audra gave regarding learn versus learned, and also whether it is useful to go about unearthing these particular stories in order to break up the mold and free yourself from something, whatever it may be?
Okay, first of all, I want to say what's up to my brother, Nazarene Beats. He's on the chat. And yeah, so to answer the question, is it natural or is it learned? I guess it's I don't want to say it's a mixture of either. One comes before the other. So there is an innate programming that exists because we're human. So the innate programming is to adhere to a hierarchy. So we're all programmed to exist within hierarchies or to want to topple the hierarchies. It doesn't really matter. We all at least have that programming to respect the existence of hierarchies. How we deal with that existence, it's dependent on each individual. I would say 85% of individuals want to exist within the hierarchy and within different levels of that hierarchy. And then there's a 15% that want to exist either on top of it or just to topple it completely. So that within that 15%, you have the libertarians, you have the communists, and then you have the anarchists. All of them exist within that 15%. Then the rest of the 85%, there are those who want to establish and continue that that hierarchical narrative. So the thing is, when you're dealing with truth, you can't come up completely and just tell things as they are, because most people would have to unravel each individual narrative in order for them to even understand what you're saying. I'll give a simplistic example is Plato's cave. When when Audra learns that in her wall that the shadows are not actually real creatures, but just shadows, she tries to come in and tell the people in the chat and me and you that these are not real concepts. This is just these abstractions are even low level. In fact, they're surface level abstractions. We're not even dealing with high level abstractions. We're like, no, Audra, have you lost your logic? For example, that's the next level from this whole conversation. It's the abstraction of the absolutes, the inabsolutes, or the infinities. She would go and try to express new understandings of these pseudo notions of meta. I can't even call it meta abstraction because it's beyond abstraction. It's meta. Now we would tell her, Audra, you're kind of losing it. What you're saying doesn't quite make sense according to what we understand as logic, right? So, delving that and juxtaposing that, what happens is that we still want to maintain some kind of narrative that we can actually assess. So ultimately, if you're trying to help people or show people the truth, you have to embed the truth within lies in order for them to actually accept it. You can't topple the whole hierarchy, because if you do that, there is no position for them to swim or float. You have to kind of, you don't have to do anything, but it's tentatively pragmatic for you to find some form of truth that is true enough for them to uphold and attach themselves to, but also has enough lies that they still have the understanding to want to continue to play this game. Because if you just tell them the whole game is pointless, right? Nihilism, for example, they're not going to play it. It's going to destroy them. It's going to fully unprepare them for the existence of a reality. So you have to kind of you have to detangle each individual lie and then juxtapose it with some lies that are acceptable. Like, for some reason, for example, there has to be something good about being a good person, for example. There has to be something good about wanting to do good things. Otherwise, it's not going to convince them to play the game that you want them to play, which is ultimately existence for all, or at least for majority.
So that is a very good point, because we keep bumping up against this knocking off of purchase, the telling of lies, the cave that you need, if you will. And so let me ask you this, Audra. Okay. Kaizo said that the truth needs to be embedded within some kind of a lie. Okay. And this is somehow useful. The danger is in the disillusion of the people and the society and so on and so forth. You cannot have that. Nihilism is bad. So let me ask you this then, from the standpoint of education, if you will, in a very simple, I'm gonna ask a very simple, perhaps silly question. What do you feel about kids and Santa Claus? And you can just take it whichever direction you want to go with these lies and why is it useful? What is the
Wait,
useful lie? And
you
so on and
mean
so forth.
Satan clause, anagram?
Uh,
That's actually a a good example to try to chew
okay,
on.
go ahead.
It's a because when you ask an actual opinion about something, there's multiple levels going on. There's what do I actually think, is sort of effective. Like, do I think it's something that's worthy of expending a lot of effort to, be like, it's so bad it needs to be gotten rid of, or does it do a lot of harm? I think it's a mixed bag. Haha. It and I think we were talking about archetypes and the idea of variance in humans and how they process information and how they respond to the same
Mhm.
event. That's already been introduced in our conversation. So I really think that's kind of the answer. There is, I think that there's probably some that benefit in their development from the fiction, and I think there's some that the effect is negligible, and I think there's probably some types that the person that are do have somewhat of a negative effect. I don't think that
Mhm.
it's a high magnitude example. I think it's not something that's kept so secret that it isn't easily discovered if one seeks to learn the truth. It's not something that, at least as I've seen it, it's not something that if you seek to learn the truth, you are vilified, right? There's a force or an organized effort to deny the actual truth of the fiction, right? So as far as fictions are concerned, it's not a self-protecting fiction. It's a very voluntary fiction. I think it's a good example of a mass voluntary fiction, right? But there's not forces marshaled to protect it, and therefore, I think most of the damage is reduced.
So this is very interesting because would it not be the case that if, in our times in liberal democracies, so on and so forth, and maybe I'm saying something completely naive, that there are not a lot of protected fictions of the kind you just mentioned, right? Like, what exactly can I not think in my head or find out or muse about or go find some obscure book and read about? What would those be? Do those actually exist?
I mean, I would say if you're going to go looking for them, well, first of all, by their nature, we're unlikely to casually be seeing them, right? They're not lying on the shelf at Fiction Walmart. Uh,
Okay.
they're sold in little back, they're on the shelves in some little back alley, little smoky, you know,
Hmm.
old store in some, you don't even know doesn't even have a sign out front. Uh, so I think to assume that they're not there is, I do think that's naive. Um,
Hmm.
I think also there's a cognitive trick in that once we see fictions, we very quickly forget that we were ever we were ever tricked by them,
Hmm.
right? It's if you brought up some political terminology. I pay quite a bit of attention to that and have look at it at quite a few different levels of perception and interaction, and you see the narrative change so quickly, and people screaming for some, they will be upset about one thing and then they're on to the next thing, and they've forgotten, to the point that often this next thing they're asking for it's not even consistent on principle with what the thing that they just asked for and then got, right? They forgot about it so much they didn't even integrate it into their understanding. They just sort of like looked at it and were like, well, that one's not a mystery anymore, moving on. So I think they're there, but I do think that they're not easy to see. I
Hmm.
think if you were going to go looking for them, um, in modern times, probably the most densely packed ones. The most densely packed shelves are going to be in governments, in sort of these massive state institute, these nation state institutions, because that's where you're going to find defenses, right? These institutions as sort of pseudo organisms, right? They defend their existence, and structurally, right? They have a sort of a structural interest in maintaining their own existence, and therefore you find a lot of constructs such as that. I think in those places. Yeah. There's other ones too, but I think those are the ones that are least seen, the fewest people have found the truth, and are the most closed off and the most offended.
This is very interesting. And before I throw it to Kaizo, whom I suspect has a couple of things to say, I want to just point out a couple of things here that. So you mentioned, different people will require or react to fictions in a different way. Some it's a bad thing, some not so good, and you're just picking that particular fiction, the Santa Claus one, right? And something you mentioned in the middle there, that people moving from fiction to fiction without even realizing that they were in the spell of this one particular fiction 2 minutes ago, and now they're in a new spell, completely different, and they do not even try to reconcile the contradictions and so on and so forth. It's very interesting because so I do music, so as such, kind of hang around a lot of artists, and because I'm an artistic type in a certain way. So in that regard, apologies to those listening, my microphone was far away. In that regard, I encounter a lot of conspiracy theorists and hippie types, with and without beads and all that stuff, with and without the namaste pants. But one thing that I noticed was, let's say the end of the world in 2020. There's this one particular character I'm thinking about right now. No, it was 2012. We remember the world was going to end, Mayan calendar. Okay, whatever. And they were so convinced about this stuff. Like, it was super heated and, took a whole big portion of their life. And then 2012 went past and they did not skip a beat, and they were on to the next thing. There was never should I evaluate my whole worldview now? Why do I keep on listening to this guy, David Wilcock? Yes, I'll mention his name, David Wilcock, one of the snake oil people out there. And he's actually a particularly good one. He has about 95% truth, which is usually good for those cocktails, the 95% truth, and then 5% just boom, just takes you off into some weird place. But this person did not even think, okay, let me they just never mentioned 2012 again. They just moved right on. So I think that is very interesting. And you're answering the question that governmental organizations, given the fact that they do have an incentive to protect themselves, will be the place where you're going to find perhaps the most guarded, if you will, truths or fictions. That's a salient point. But go ahead, Kaizo, and did you have any reactions to all that was just said?
Yeah, so I'm gonna call that effect the Dunning fantasy effect, right? It's like it's a juxtaposition of the Dunning-Kruger effect, but for Dunning fantasy. So the individual gets caught up in a fantasy, but they don't acknowledge that they themselves were part of that fantasy, and they see themselves as always being slightly above that fantasy. And each successive fantasy that they overcome, they never saw themselves as being part of the fantasy. They were never engraved. Or if it was a black hole, the fantasy, let's abstract it to a black hole. If the fantasy is a black hole, they were never in the singularity. They're always at the event horizon. Somehow they reached escape velocity outside of each successive black hole. So they don't perceive themselves as ever having been ingrained within that fantasy. So it's a Dunning fantasy effect. Now that's for some of them. Now for some people, really truly, they really were at the surface edge of the fantasies because they never truly bought into it. They were almost manipulating the fantasies for their own end, meaning they were buying the fantasy because they know the fantasy is a real entity within the social space, but they don't actually believe in the actual fantasy in the sense that they believe in the tenets of that fantasy. I'll give a simple example. So most of us grew up with Disney Channel about love and all these movies about finding the one, etc. Now, the blue pilled people, they actually truly believed in it, and they thought if they acted in such a way, they would find their true love. But then, as our generation has grown up, the millennials or whatever that we call ourselves, and even Gen Z to an extent, they grew up and they realized this is bull. This is nothing to do with reality. However, most of us, unfortunately, we still want to continue and force that narrative into existence, as opposed to accepting that actually, yeah, this was never true to begin with. Now, some of us would have recognized that this story never made sense to begin with, and would have escaped that flow and reached into the next black hole, and continue that spiral outside of the event horizon. And maybe we wouldn't be part of that so-called Dunning fantasy effect, but most of us unfortunately would have been part of it, and some of us are still stuck in it. They just keep telling ourselves, well, it just didn't work out with that person, rather than reanalyzing yourself, telling yourself the whole story, that a human being is within himself or herself struggling to even make sense to him or herself, meaning there is already that internal struggle within self, and to then add another entity onto self and then interact with that other entity within a very intimate space is already in itself unnatural within the cosmos. So even just dealing and making that whole system function is in itself not the right, well, I can't use the word right, it's not the so-called most natural manner. Meaning they have to accept that this is actually a miracle that even a relationship can function for 60 years. That is an unnatural state of being. And to then eradicate that and then reanalyze yourself and get rid of that whole narrative, it's something that's going to cause turmoil in the internal, in the person's internal mind state. It's very difficult for them to accept that it's not even supposed to be the case, that the norm actually is for disorder in that case. Because what you're doing is you're trying to take entropy, which is naturally supposed to dissipate into the ether, and then constrain that entropy into a singularity, and then take those two singularities of two juxtaposed same energy, put them together. And of course, the closer you bring things together that have the same energy, the further apart they're going to repel once they reach a certain position. So just the whole concept, to be able to understand that actually it's an unnatural thing for a relationship to even work itself, can't be accepted by most of us.
Okay, so I've never heard the pills being discussed using the black hole, some gravitation and some electromagnetism with the bringing of the two charges together, and so on and so forth. I like that. Now, that is very interesting in the practical thing that you mentioned, which is this. Okay, you're going to bring two people together. Okay, and I like to. Last time I mentioned this in my channel, some conversation ago, was just talking about the practical effects now of relationships, or the practical consequences, the things that need to be dealt with. And people say, well, maybe you just marry your best friend, or maybe you do. I think it was actually you I was talking to, Kaizo. And then we said, you don't have to share a house and a bed and all that kind of stuff and wake up every morning with your best friend. That these are just practical. It's not a question of some kind of ideal behavioral this, that, the other. It's like these kinds of arrangements just don't happen anywhere else. And it is very, as you say, to use your phrase, unnatural, right? To think that there's going to be some ideal situation that comes from it is kind of crazy. So, and for those of us who still are going in headlong to participate in these kinds of things, maybe we have a little bit of maybe we like a little bit of torture, so on and so forth. But let me ask you this, starting with Kaizo, and then Audra, you can chime in. And this has to do, it hinges on what is on the screen right now about the Santa story. We talked about the Santa story, okay? And ladies and gentlemen, for those of you whom are new here, go ahead, like, subscribe, share if you are so moved, okay? But like, subscribe, bell button, and all, okay? If you're new to the channel, you like, and then you subscribe, you hit the bell button, and you hit the all. It's the LSBA algorithm, okay? Like, subscribe, bell button, all. And today we're talking about the fact that you live in Storyville, everything you know about who you are, where we are, and even your epistemology in general about how you grok things, how you think of metaphysics and scientific knowledge has to do with some kind of a narrative framework. So the question now is the narrative of Santa. Something is on the screen that says some kind of a positive about it. Okay. So let me lay out the landscape, if you will, of, let's say, positives. I've heard the positive, for example, let's say what is said here, opening up the imagination. I would put it in this way, like putting some, it kind of puts a zest, a wonder into life. One may question, that, well, why do you need, this is my own personal metaphysics, why do you need a miracle in order to be amazed by the universe? It's like you open your eyes and anything exists at all. Should that not be enough? Why do you have to invent a red guy with a coat? What's so special about this bearded guy with a coat? We're talking about the fact that the universe actually exists. That's not enough for you, but let's leave that aside. Okay. That's just me, my personal kind of whatever. I'm getting triggered. Point is, it puts some zest into life. It puts some piss and vinegar into your whole worldview. And I'm not talking about the Santa story in particular. I'm just using the Santa story as an example, right? That this idea of grand things out there, the idea of magic, right? The world out there as a larger story, a different story, rather than your tiny little family story, some bigger story that you could be part of, right? Now this puts some imagination, so that's the case for the Santa story is good. The case that I've heard for the Santa story not being good is one from Ayn Rand, which says basically you are teaching people to believe in an irrational universe, a universe where they do not have control or understanding. That there's this guy, bearded guy that comes in, flying, and it goes in through this chimney. Why? How? Doesn't make sense to me. I have no control over this. This is scary. In other words, you're creating this chaotic world in their minds. Okay. So starting with Kaizo, what do you think about this? Okay. We're talking again about the stories. You talked about the fact that the truths need to be embedded in lies. Okay. You already gave an example of why the lies are somewhat necessary. The cave is necessary, so on and so forth. The systems, the structures are necessary. Can't go full nihilism. Okay. A smaller part of a cave, a very, flimsy one, a little flimsy cave is the story of Santa. And we say, even in there is some truth and good to come out of it. And then the other side says, hey, you are putting this disjointed, ridiculous universe in people's heads, children's heads, and you're making them feel alienated from the world, which should be a rational place with billiard balls moving in predictable directions and so on and so forth. What do you say?
Okay, so let's start with Santa, for example. I mean, that's an anagram for Satan, right? That's filled with a lot of, European, Germanic pagan traditions. I'm not going to go down that path for this conversation, but let's respond to the actual question, which is mythological grand narratives. Are they useful or are they detrimental? Well, the thing is, both those the positives and the negatives are irrelevant, right? Because the thing is, so the so-called negative of teaching people to believe in irrational possibilities, etc. First of all, rationality as well as so-called abstractions, they meet a point whereby actually they might be the same. For example, Einstein realized that the Newtonian equations weren't complete. And by adding that whole abstraction about time and space and bending of space-time, that would have seemed like an irrational proposition without the proof that he did get from the observatory, etc. So to even postulate possibilities, you can't then dub that as irrational, right? Because that's part of the issue. So even that whole statement by Ayn Rand that there is some kind of so-called irrationality predisposed within that whole thinking frame is already sort of limited, because that's a two-dimensional reasoning potential. The whole if this then that type logic, which isn't actually the logic that governs the universe, because the universe is more abstract, and then the if then that then just allows us to navigate and move within that system. But it's not the actual truth of that system, because you can't explain infinity using linear points in space and time, X, Y, and Z. In fact, just X and Y, because it's only 2 dimensions. You haven't even exerted the Z dimension into that whole kind of conversation. So without the Z dimension, and then just calling it rational because it doesn't fit into the 2-dimension type logic, even that in itself is incomplete from my understanding. Now, so the so-called positives of it, enlarging your understanding and your so-called ideation capabilities, etc. I mean, yeah, sure. I mean, that's just a consequence of, ideating in anything, right? You don't have to create grand narratives for it. You could just expose them to actual philosophy, right? Why create low-level abstractions about the potential existence of things when you can actually basically embed them with Plato's cave story, for example? I mean, you could do that if you wanted, and make that a cultural thing, a theme if you wanted. But then again, that's still low-level, because I guess you just need a substrate that is high level enough that you could make a million interpretations from it, and the substrate doesn't really matter too much what it is. If it exists and many people can absorb it and update it into their software that they've acquired across their childhood, then it really doesn't matter. That's what I'll say on that one.
Excellent. And what do you have to say?
Well, I'm gonna take a stance here and kind of, after thinking about it, like, I don't necessarily see a great deal of long-term psychological benefit from a myth such as Santa Claus, right? These, I would actually pose an argument that it is not an introduction to chaos. It is a blanket, a protection from it. It's, you could look at it, because something that keeps coming back to me is this idea of, we were talking about people sort of being drawn to having a narrative, despite in over consistency, over their own personal narrative consistency, and it's and I was thinking about it, and the pseudo image that keeps popping up in my head is this idea of a solid state result or observation versus a continuous or fluid sort of thing. And so there's this seeking of narrative, of explanation, right? So they'd rather have, where you could look at Santa Claus like, well, it's a narrative, and if we're talking about, because we were talking about development and what we might be teaching children, to value a narrative, an explanation over actual observation, right? That the thing to seek is an explanation, whether it makes sense or not, right? As long as you've got a narrative, there's your answer, right? There's your comfort, there's your certainty, there's your solid state, I guess, feel good spot. But
do you find that to be useful? Do you think that because I am partial to that whole give them a cave, don't knock them off purchase, whatever the purchase, whatever the explanatory framework is, even if it's Santa, so on and so forth, that is just purely from the standpoint of hearing the argument. It sounds good to me, because for me, I'm one of those people that it doesn't really quite apply to, as we talk about different people and how they react to different kinds of stories. I have my own thing going with, stories and so on and so forth. But when I hear somebody say, hey, don't go knocking people off their purchase, they need the cave, they need a little matrix, they need some explanatory framework. If you break it off, no matter what there is, there needs to be one. How does that strike you? And is that a good thing?
I think that specific analogy, my sort of trite response would be, yeah, we can discuss knocking them off purchase, but I would say don't build them purchase in the first place, right? I think those same people, like, they go and they're like, oh, let me build you a perch, and they're like, don't knock them off. I'm like, you built the perch. So I kind of think there's a, if we'd build less perches for people and set them on them, I think maybe we would have less of a discussion about whether we should knock them off.
Okay, so less purchase being built. And earlier on, Kaizo kind of described this 85% of people wanting to stay in this hierarchy, 15% are commies, and you have the libertarians and such, and so on and so forth. Okay, don't build purchase. Sounds within the political landscape, Audra. what would you say? What? How does that manifest itself? Is that a libertarian kind of stance of don't build any collective purchase out there. Let each individual, maximal freedom, maximal agency kind of deal. What does that look like in the political landscape?
Well, I think, you know, I think the trick is because I do have the, kind of the answer here, because like, well, if you're not going to build purchase for people, like we're assuming they're going to, you need a perch, right? We have to stand on something. That's kind of the counter argument, right? My answer would be what we should be doing is teaching and giving methodologies, right? We should be teaching children how to build their own perch and how to how to construct a good perch, not building the perch for them, right? Because and this really kind of I think encapsulates a lot of what you're asking here, and the libertarian philosophy of and it goes back to biblical stories. Teach somebody to fish, don't give them fish, right? Like this is a story that comes up in a lot of grand narratives, right? This is a teaching. But if you build the perch for them and then you knock them off, you're again looking at why it would be better to teach them methods of building perches, even if you maybe help them a little with their first one, right? As mentor or teacher or whatever, is that when they fall off, and I would say that inevitably perches are going to be falling off of, whether you get knocked off or not, right? It's not you can't stay there, and the longer you do, the worse off you are. But you're going to get knocked off. Everybody does to some degree or another. But if you have no method of building it, if you had no involvement in building it in the first place, you're much more adrift and afloat, right, when that finally happens. And I think again, from the politically, I think that lines up pretty well with libertarian-esque philosophy, which I do hang out in that corner of the world somewhere over there on that side of however many dimensions that map is. But it's not uncharitable. It's not everybody fend for themselves. It's not non-communal. It's just don't do it for don't just take all the responsibility away. Don't do it for somebody. And then and from a moral aspect, I think where the moral aspect comes in is, and we were talking about power and controlling. I think that the interesting thing about a philosophy like this is that it is not self-empowering, right? A real individualist sort of libertarian philosophy is not self-empowering. It doesn't give you a ton of power over other people, right? If you just want to control people and be at the top of the pyramid, which is a very easy thing to go for, right? That's an easy, okay, that tastes good. I'll just founder on that for the rest of my life. It is a self-effacing, sort of self-sacrificing when it comes to overall power over other people way of going about things, right? It's like if you build the perch, then you have all control. The perch is there. Where the keystone in the perch is. Like, you can threaten that person on the perch. You're like, don't cross me, or I'm gonna pull the perch out from under you, right? Or things like that, right? So so that's the other side of it, is not just why I think it's a good thing. I think it's a good thing to teach them how to build a perch and have some involvement in that themselves. But also the other side of that is one of the forces that acts against that being sort of common practice or the most common narrative, shall we say, is that there is power in not doing that, right? There's power in being the perch builder, in controlling perches, in having the blueprints for perches, and having people afraid that they would never find another perch, right? And I think that's a genuine fear. If they didn't build it, they're like, I don't know how to build perches. What? I'll just fall off in infinity.
I have a question for you. I have a question for you that has to do with your personal story with regards to purchase and so on and so forth. But for those whom may or may not be just joining, passing through, okay? What we're talking about today is the fact that you live in Storyville, that you do not know who you are, where you are, or what this is, how to act. Your ethical stories are embedded, or your ethical knowledge are embedded in a narrative. Okay, what would Jesus do? What would Goku do? What would Han Solo do? That you cannot abstract out the code. Okay, you need the whole story with the characters and the timeline, the plot, the actions taken with the whole theme, okay, with the whole narrative. And that's how you organize scientific knowledge. That's how you organize knowledge about yourself. Your identity is a story, part of the political story as well, part of the story of your family, ongoing into the past and into the future, so on and so forth. And the purchase that Aurora was just referring to, these are stories, these are narratives, these are frameworks, okay? And we're asking, well, is it useful, even if you know that this story is rather shaky, it's a little fake, it's a lie, which all stories are from a certain perspective. But is it useful to what should your relationship be with people and their purchase vis-a-vis power and so on and so forth? And Aurora is saying, help them, show them how to build purchase. And I'm going to ask you, were you taught how to build purchase? Okay. Did somebody give you the tools of rational thinking? What did that look like for you if that was the case, right? And or what would it look like if someone were to implement your teach them to build purchase, to teach them to rationally look at a foundational structure, a framework for looking at things, so on and so forth. It may be the scientific method over here, maybe whatever it may be, right? Were you taught, and also what would it look like to teach people that?
So I'll best I can answer is I would say yes. I had a very, I would say, atypical childhood. I in my own way, as much as is possible in the U.S. Like I grew up a lot out of the system. I was homeschooled. I actually grew up on a farm and ranch, a long ways from other people, and was so I was just some examples. My parents were also very intelligent, critical thinkers, so I was expected to be able to sort of converse with that. I mean, I think at a most basic level, probably. First of all, I'll just insert here what I think the sort of key word is, the common language thing that I would say needs to be taught is the thing we call critical thinking, right? That's really, can debate about what that is, but I think there's a very simple thing, and that's sort of the meta method. That's meta methodology, right? That's critical thinking is how to build instructions, right? Not how to follow them, right? Or how to evaluate them.
Could we say could I say trial and error? Does that encapsulate the critical thinking thing? Or it's just a one particular set? If you're trying to do something, then
I would say that trial and error is a method for teaching critical thinking. Like it's
okay,
because trial and error it's like a particle collider, right? You blow a bunch of stuff up and then you analyze the splatter. Trial and error is the same thing. It's like you mess stuff up but you have to have the critical thinking to be able to interpret the splatter in order to move forward, right? Right. It's not critical thinking to necessarily to do trial and error, but it's the ability to make use of trial and error, I suppose.
That kind of thinking, what you call critical thinking, and the reason why I asked this question is it's quite interesting for me because I don't really know how to answer that question for myself. In other words, whenever I hear critical thinking, I always go like, was I ever did anybody teach me that? What would it even look like for somebody to teach me? Or when I encounter people who do not practice critical thinking, I'm like, how could I even tell them what they're missing right now?
Right.
And so on. So it always just comes across as dry to me, like critical thinking. Did I ever consume that biscuit, that dry biscuit? I don't remember consuming it. But for some reason it's there. So I'm trying to find out from you, where did you get it if it's something that is imparted upon people?
So if I had to describe, I think there is a trick because it's you can't it's almost something you can't draw a picture of, right? It isn't something you can show, be like, this is critical thinking, like learn this. I think the way to teach critical thinking is is a methodology of, it's not quite trial and error, but it's sort of exposure and processing, right? It's and in a guided system, right? In say if you were designing an education, you would do it in measured doses. You would, it's almost at a very meta level. It's almost exposure to chaos and then the ability to, and then the response, right? And you can't teach someone how to respond to that. You can give them ideas, right? You can provide examples, but the point is the ability to make something intelligible out of that without but the whole point, I think, of critical thinking is without giving them the answer, without giving them the structure, right? Building that, and it comes back to that building that perch, just having to build a little structure yourself without, the equivalent of, people learning to swim by throwing them in the pool, right? But, you can do it in more measured doses. But at the same time, you throw somebody in the pool and they're gonna learn a lot of that. Like I had some, I probably had more of that throwing in the pool than a lot of kids, especially of our generation. Like I, used to walk like 3 miles to my cousin's house through rattlesnake pasture, and nobody. I was all over the place. I also have stories, like I used to run off and we'd like a hotel in town, and I'm pretty sure I caused my parents a few panic attacks because I was perhaps a little too comfortable with exploring the unknown at a pretty young age. But that it was. It was like, again, there was the freedom, that space to go, and again, in a guided environment, you could measure out exposures to those uncertainties, and there isn't a right answer. There's just survive. There's, be able to maintain your sanity after being exposed to uncertainty, and being able to, find purchase, in that, in things that are a little unstable or uncertain, but. And I do think having other people around engaging in it, right? It is something that it can't be, it's not something that can be directly mimicked, as in, monkey see, monkey do. But at the same time, it's something that can be intuitive. Just like in this example, I use the word critical thinking, and I always, kind of know I'm releasing a kind of a splash bomb when I use like a really common term like that. It's like, oh, it's a giant mess when you deal with a really common terminology. But there's an intuitive knowledge of kind of what that is, and even a lot of people, I think, that may use it, they can't describe it, may not even be very good at it, but most people, I think, can recognize it. Like, it is something that can be recognized and intuited. And so again, a little controlled exposure to chaos, and then and again, being seeing examples of it, I think those two things are the kind of components to teaching it. But it's hard because this one little comment is like, because if you're a teacher or controlling one of these systems, even us, we would love to be able to just like grab some little kid and be like, we're going to teach you critical thinking, right? And the world's going to be better. And there's an ego element to that, right? There's an ego of wanting that result, of wanting to be able to bring that about. And I think one of the more difficult things with these sort of, in a peripheral kind of things that you can't directly just take and do and show, is that in order, and these teaching methodology, I think, it's not clear. You can't draw a picture. You can't have a test on it, every week. It's hard. You got to take that ego out of it. You have to let it out of your control, right? It's like in the very act of teaching it, you're actually sort of having to expose yourself to some uncertainty, right? and that's that seems to be generally an uncomfortable. Everybody seeks to certainty and credit, and they want to do good, and they want to know that they've done good. They want to know that they got that good result, and giving that up is very difficult.
Yeah, so you definitely intuited several things. You knew there was going to be a reaction when you threw out the word, the phrase critical thinking, and also for me, in particular, going back to the reason why I asked the question, is because it's one of those things where I just cannot see how, or I don't know how I got it. I don't know how I can clearly impart it on someone else, and so on and so forth. But in line with the comment that is on the screen, right? You talked about exposure. This person is saying basically they already know how to build. By they, I'm assuming he's talking about like children and stuff like that. You need somebody to be on the side watching them going through the trial, and somebody on the side also living their life too, as you said, right? Participating in trial and error and growth, and this is the way that they can learn, they being the children. And I'll ask you, Kaiser, what you think about all this being, how one goes about doing the whole critical thinking thing. But I find myself, I'm a kind of, a teacher type. I get pedagogical every now and again. And the way I've tried to do this kind of a thing, let's say, for example, authority, okay? And I know that my biases, what I'm trying to find out is my particular biases here, okay? Because one of the things that I try to, maybe it's a shattering of a perch, that's why I need to be careful. I try to make, let's say, children understand the plausible sources of authority, let's say parental authority, right? Like, why should you listen to me? Right? Because, and this is my personal bias, I'm the kind of person that would wonder that, right? And I'm not sure everybody wonders that kind of a thing. I don't think everybody's going around, why should I listen? But for me, it's that kind of a thing, like, what's going on here? What's the structure here? Okay, I get it. Okay, are we doing the Catholic thing? Is it God on top, and then the king, and then the father? Okay, what exactly is going on? Okay, and then what I try to do is I try to tell the person, okay, you do have to listen to me, okay? And I try to use a game structure, like, okay, this is in the classroom, who's the head, who's in charge? Okay, it's the teacher. Okay, over here, I'm in charge. Okay, and then I try to do the power and responsibility thing, right? You need to listen to me because I have the responsibility, and therefore I have the power. You know how before you didn't know how to bathe yourself? You didn't have the power, you didn't have the responsibility. But now that you can bathe yourself, you have that power and that responsibility. Therefore, you govern that domain, and then try to expose things in that way, in terms, it kind of expand it, where it's like, okay, it's about power and responsibility. That's where authority comes from. Okay, I kind of get it. The parents have the ultimate power here in the house, and that's why they have the responsibility. That's why I have to listen to them, that kind of a thing. So things like that I naturally do, just because I've always been the kind to always question everything, right? So, but I don't know if that is a bias of mine, whereby I'm going around knocking a kid off their perch when it should be just, oh, the dad is God, that's why I listen to him, not because he has the economic responsibility and he has learned to do X, and therefore he has the responsibility, that's why he has the power. But yes, those are just my own musings on that. But Kaizo, what do you think about both what I just said in terms of how I address the whole issue of imparting critical thinking, and how to get outside of our particular biases, right? Things that we think, oh well, this will be the way. Let me give you some let me give you some red pill truth right now, or whatever, right? When people are like, why, no one asked for this silly pill of yours, and this is ridiculous. But all that big ball of wax I just threw at you, yeah, you go ahead and take it and do with it what you will. You are muted, Kaizo, or did I mute you? Or go ahead and unmute yourself, sir.
Yeah, so I'll start off with what Audrey actually mentioned about teaching people how to actually fish, as opposed to creating a system whereby they're given the fish and then they're just kind of taught how to distribute the fish amongst each other. Now, the thing here is, that from an abstract, clean perspective, that does seem like the best way to approach this whole situation. The problem is, I'm going to get a bit murky here, but one of the reasons why communism can't exist within a universe is because there's capitalism. Capitalism is going to obviously make more money, and as a competitive substructure, it's going to win out, and the communists are going to fail. Same thing between matriarchal and patriarchal systems. Matriarchal systems, if we are allowed to be as abstract clean as it is, will basically lose, because they wouldn't have as much drive or I guess the masculine aspect to actually push forward and win the game. So the same thing here, I guess, between the libertarian versus the socialitarian system is that the socialitarian system is going to give people sweet candy and it's going to seduce them. It's a seducing spirit that will actually create a structure whereby people are told, hey, you don't need to go out there into the river and get the fish out. We'll teach you how to sell the fish to each other, and you guys can kind of rely on us to produce the fish for you. So the issue here, I guess, is the seducing spirits, that the other systems are more seductive to people. So therefore, more people generally get seduced to it. The only kind of way for this kind of seduction to be overcome is if there is a whole community, a country filled with so-called libertarians who are, many of them, successful people. Then the other spirits who were seduced by the other system see and be like, oh, actually, I could become a thousandaire. A thousandaire is like a pseudo-millionaire, right? So you'd have to have the libertarian system to reach critical mass in so-called perceptual productivity for the other people to then to be ensnared by that system, so that they can then join in to that system. Ultimately, we're playing a game of narratives and seduction, basically. Which side? Because ultimately, different people value truths differently. So Audreyrian people prefer truth at its purest abstraction. Icarian people prefer ideation at its purest ideation, just for the sake of ideation. Kaisorian people prefer, well, they don't really have a preference, right? So each individual has their own god, I guess, that they worship, right? Some worship truth, etc., etc. So ultimately, if we are putting this into the action space potential, you would have to create a system whereby the libertarian reaches critical mass to then ensnare the rest of it. Ultimately, it has to be a game there, because truth in it, not many of us value truth for the sake of truth, or truth even for the sake of long-term trans-temporal success markers, because we all exist within hierarchical structures. The now and what sort of appreciations we get right now matters a lot. For example, the so-called African American people, once they were liberated from their struggles, a lot of them started to acquire this whole very capitalistic system whereby they wanted to show that they were successful. So they would want to buy expensive cars, expensive jewelry, etc., so that they can have the markers of success. Now, these markers of success were even more important than the actual success, right? So they preferred to look successful. Many of them are supposed to even just have the money or the system in their banks. So unfortunately, within each temporal constraints, there exist hierarchical constraints that then govern how basically a system functions. It's hard for us to kind of escape that temporal so-called temporal pull into that whole dimension there. And in relation to I guess to how you then look at it, the whole system of how critical thinking can be taught. Again, I'm going to be a skeptic here. Not skeptic. What's the word? I guess it's what's the negative? What is it called? Pessimist, I guess. Yeah, that's it. I'm going to sound pessimistic, but ultimately what you do is you want to teach a community or population to adopt a culture of critical thinking, and then generally you're going to reach a standard deviation or so higher within that community that adopts these principles than a community that doesn't. So ultimately you will teach far more people how to critical think. However, the essence of being able to critical think isn't birthed equally across all personality types. Only some people have the ability, which then if it's kind of developed, to actually reach that essence of critical thinking. Because the aspect of critical thinking requires you to buy into some stories, but then negate other stories, and then also to be able to move on to other stories successively. It's not a personality type that basically accepts things statically across time. That's part of the issue with the critical thinking. Is a critical thinker is able to accept new truths while not necessarily discounting the previous truth, but still being able to see it as meh and then move on with it. And this isn't something that is ingrained within most of us. So only some of us, unfortunately, can actually do it. And I would say that obviously some courses, some so-called formal education systems will obviously allow this, engineering or philosophy or maths. For example, these kind of systems would allow you to kind of gain insights into this space, because ultimately what you're doing is you're dealing with the realities that that, for example, if I'm trying to build an engineering building, right? Sorry, if I'm trying to engineer the structural integrity for a building design, so an architecture designs a building, and then I have to, as an engineer, decide if the building is possible into this reality space within a 200-year time space. I have to actually use math that actually exists and that actually is going to work. No matter how beautiful the architectural design looks, I can't recommend the design to go forward if the structural integrity is within the lower boundary limits of stress strain, for example. The problem is when it comes to people, we already have these reward systems whereby if somehow we think people are somehow some special creatures that are different from other objects, when in reality a human being is just the same as an object, and an object is the same as human. A human might be more complex than an object, but they're exactly the same thing in the space of truth, meaning that there is no real difference between a person and an object. The problem is when we think of people, we create all these exceptions and all these not necessarily linear logic-based abstractions, then that ends up leading us to these delusions, right? We delude ourselves that, well, you know what, that's true. He may not necessarily do this, even though there's like a 99% chance that that's going to happen. But when you're building a beam for an engineering project, you don't think like that. You think in not absolutes exactly, but you think in buffer zones, potentials within a buffer system. So part of the problem is actually being able to being able to actually see that people are just a form of object. Now, it doesn't mean you should treat people as objects. Obviously, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is you should acknowledge that they are objects, but at the same time, objects that exist within a social sphere, and accept both those truths. If you can do that, then you can have critical thinking. Otherwise, that's unfortunately the kind of cutoff. If people can't see that the two are related in some space, it gets murky in that space.
So you have to teach a culture, a population, how to do this. Okay, individuals have different capacities and so on and so forth within this population. How we found it difficult to talk about how you could do this with an individual, but how are you going to do this with a population? And hold on, before you go there, let me go ahead and give shout out to John Guillory for the $10 Cash App. Marcus Garvey in the house for the 25 or the $20 Cash App, and D Rock Den says salute. Mark Garvey said great YouTube stream, Ike, and John Gilroy said great programming tonight. So maybe I missed it in what you said, but how would you go about putting this I'm gonna put this culture thing to work?
Yeah, so Audra made a point there as well. Yeah, it's not just teaching people. You have to create a culture around it. Now, the problem with society at the moment is we have limited reward systems in place. What I mean by this is that, let's say, talk about SMV, right? You have the Chads, you got the Stacys, you got people who people look up to, right? As the ideal in the space. You got not politicians, athletes. You have the successful music rappers. You have all these kinds of people in the mainstream of what people deem as acceptable and also desirable. Now, the issue is we haven't got an equal position for other groups of people that are also as successful in their own domains who are preferred. So the problem here is that what we need to do is create a near infinite number of games that are also rewarded and preferred in society. Now, by near infinite, I don't actually really mean it. I actually mean just 10 or 11 different systems. For example, we could create a system whereby we actually do prefer nerds and so-called hyper-intellectuals who are always trying to be accurate and correct. We can actually do this. We reward them, and you could design the reward system. It really doesn't matter how you do it, but you create that culture in there that nerds who actually know things at such a high level are actually rewarded. Then you also create a reward system for meta abstractors, so philosophers, mathematicians, and anyone who wants to kind of elucidate truth to a certain level. They're also rewarded in their game. And once you create these different games in society where they're rewarded, you then actually create a culture around where actually people can find their positions, as opposed to kind of following suit into the whole so-called celebrity / athlete sort of archetype, because they are rewarded. They are seen as, for example, a celebrity's opinion on things is somehow valued above the actual people who are studying finance and economics. Joe Biden went to seek Cardi B, for example. I mean, it makes no sense. You know, she's not intellectual in any sense. I'm not saying she's not intelligent. I'm saying she's not an intellectual. So the problem there is that unfortunately we value only a few things. Money. If someone has money, we value their opinion, even though they may be saying nothing. So basically, creating games whereby we value and reward. That's the most important. Socially reward intellectuals.
All right, you heard Kaizo. Kaizo said that you need to go to the Cash App. All right.
Yep. Exactly.
And you need to share and like the stream. You need to hit up the super chat. You need to pay what is due to the algorithm so that conversations such as this kind can be promoted in all corners, this corner of YouTube and everywhere else. But yes, I definitely understand what you're saying. I do not know how to inculcate this particular thing. Like, yeah, you have the Eastern European Jews, Ashkenazi Jews, if you will, and how they have been worshiping a book forever, and books from birth till death, they're just bleeding out books from every, and yes, no surprise, they win those Nobel Prizes and so on and so forth, right? I'm also, from Africa, where the hierarchy in terms of whom is respected, Nigeria in particular, was not so much, the jock kind of thing or whatever. The jock was there mainly on it was more primal in that sense. Yeah, but there was no kind of a respect given outside of just the primal stuff. So everybody knew who was going to run things, and it was the guy who was going to be the smart doctor over there. And everybody wanted to be smart. Everybody wanted to be smart, otherwise you're going to fall off. And nobody wants to be that guy who fell off. So I understand that there are societies who place varying amounts of reverence, if you will, right, on this particular thing. I don't know how you can inculcate it, is all I'm saying. Well, other than, again, what we're doing right now, let's say, right? We're out here having this kind of a conversation in spaces which perhaps are not, as I said, my last 3 streams have been unabashedly intellectual, and it may, and I think that anyone who has been watching my channel will know the kind of like a hard pivot there. Not because I'm staying here forever, but it was to try out this kind of a lane to see for a little bit things that are a little less practical, if you will, even though I bring it down to the practical level at all points. Now, speaking of the practical level, and you guys have been very, very great guests, by the way. Very, very great guests. But let's close this up. Let's wrap up this conversation by bringing it down to the practical sense. I mentioned in the very beginning that we do not know where we are. We do not know where we live or whom we are unless we embed it in story, that we live in Storyville. We live in Storyville. Our advertising and marketing knows this, okay? Almost $1 trillion industry in terms of revenue, almost $1 trillion spent curating stories, selling stories, and so on and so forth. You do not know who you are. The political order is also a story. You are a story made up of information from your chronology. You put a narrative on it. You play a role. Maybe you play the victim role. Maybe you play the survival role. Maybe you are participating in the hero's journey right now. Okay. How do you know what to do? You have to ask questions like, what would Jesus do? What would Goku do? What would Han Solo do? Our framework of understanding ethical knowledge is embedded in a story. We cannot abstract and give a code. People do try to do that. Audra mentioned earlier the pseudo geometric way, right? Which tries to bring up this higher level abstraction that tends to tell you, well, this is why you should do what you should do. And Kant's universal rules and the universal law, those kinds of things. But really, the most effective ones, the most potent ones are the story. The most effective ones are the what would Jesus do? And I say that it is the first, quite practically speaking. I shouldn't say practically. It is a matter of fact that the stories came first, okay? And the story way of looking at the world is a given, whether you are looking at even mathematical truths and all the way down to metaphysics, which the biggest story of the biggest character called the story of God. And if you take away God from it, you you have to replace it with some other kind of the universe, the force, the thing, you know. It's almost inevitable that our consciousness seems to be formed that way. This tends to then segue into a conversation of consciousness, which I'm glad we didn't go into that whole hornet's nest of consciousness. And
It's a
but
tempting
that's
black
probably
hole. But yeah, we tiptoed around it.
yeah. Oh yeah. Oh my God. That perhaps another conversation where we go into consciousness, and then we can talk about subject and object being mutually self-defining, so on and so forth. Um, but let me ask you this question, okay? What are the practical things that we can glean from this conversation? And I'm going to mute myself real quick because I have to take this phone call. But what are the practical things that we can glean? Go ahead and start, Audra.
I think, practically to start with, depending at, shall we say, what what level of falling off the perch one is when it comes to these matters. Uh, the ability, the first step in ascertaining skill or value or any of these things really is observation. Especially I think when we're trying to draw ourselves out of sort of the automated, more automatic narratives, or whatever it is. So discussing these things, once you can see it, then you can decide what to do about it. Reminds me, and the choice is, we've talked about the wisdom or the value of jumping off your perch, and doing that as a habit. Depending on what you think your valued outcomes are, the pros and cons of that choice can vary. So I mean, you can pull a what's his name from the Matrix, and you can plug yourself back in to a certain degree. That's always a viable choice. I think often we think of distasteful choices or choices that aren't often advantageous. We're in the habit of not even considering them. It's like you're trying to making a choice for survival. You're like, I had no choice. You're like, you could always die. That's always, considering those low probability choices. But I think the existential value is really getting a better sight line. You can sometimes, through exercises like this, if you're going to jump off your perch, you can actually try to see a little further before you do, right? So there's preparations for that. You can decide to stay on your perch. And then in a further down the road level, I mean, and this is, the more in the Machiavellian direction, it's understanding these things, being able to see them, does give you a lot of power. Like that's as simple as it is. And you can, from mild influence, or just, if the simplest things of just, if you just want to keep people happy, you're like, hey, you go to Christmas and families all fighting, it's like you can use those powers for good. You can just keep everybody chill and calm the fights down, or you can use it to your advantage, or you can cause trouble. Like it's a lot like critical thinking. It's a very universally applicable power. It's not something that's limited to one context or one situation, and it's very scalable. It works at an interpersonal level. It works at a family, kind of immediate group level. It works at very large levels. You can, if you want to get into politics and manipulate a whole, try to steer and see the flows at a whole, whole state population, right, or a whole country. Like that's for my, that this is, to me, this is one of the elements that really. And again, I'm bringing it to politics, but we kept bringing that up, and I think it's highly relevant because it is used in politics. It is, whether it is used well or whether it is used knowingly, it is the biggest, the biggest stick in politics. It's involved in everything, and so the ability to recognize it is valuable, to not be overly controlled by those big political influences waving around. And then if you do want to become involved in that particular sort of book, that of at that level, it really can separate you from being basically just, you know, taken up in the stream, because a big stream like politics, most people get in it, and you know, and we've all seen it. This is a trope. People with good intentions decide to go to Washington, and nothing changes. They follow the same behaviors. They become almost cookie cutters of whoever it is they were, you know, all excited to replace. And it's those bigger the systems, the heavier the current is in those streams that like to flow that way. And like I said, I have messed around in this area, and it takes a lot. You know, if you didn't know it was there, you'd never avoid it. And it takes both backbone and, you know, the ability to know that it's there. And you know, you can somewhat stay out of the deeper waters, but you know, and that gives you a lot of power. You know, if 99% of everybody's over in the river, and you're managing to cut a new little stream, it's hard, but it doesn't give institutional power, right? The institutions hate it. You don't get a label that says you have power, but if you're evaluating power at the level of actual influence, and over time, you know, kind of bang for pound for pound, you get it's way better, right? But yeah, it's like I said, it's practically, it's like I said, at a personal level, even if you're not want to be involved, it helps keep you from being manipulated, right? So it both has protective power, and if you want to use it as such, it has a lot of, you know, agency power as well. So.
Gotcha. 100%. So you can choose to avoid it. You can stay out of the deep waters. You can practice a strike, if you will. Like you can strike, you can step out of the quote unquote system or a particular storyline. And that is a way in which a lot of people have agency, which I don't think that they do consider. A lot of people think they have to be in the fray all the time. And as you mentioned, the fray is just the phrase a microcosm, but there's a big little current going on, and you're just a little particle flowing down this big current. But there is a lot of power in stepping aside and be like, I'm not going to participate. No, I'm not going to argue about Orange Man bad on YouTube, on Facebook, for or against. I'm just going to ignore you, right? 100% complete. I think there's a lot of power in that. So good points. Now, Kaizo, what would you have to say regarding what are pragmatic, practical things to be gleaned from knowledge of Storyville? You're muted again, sir.
Okay, yeah. So I won't repeat what Audrey said. I'll just continue from it. So she's given the benefits of from an individualistic perspective of every individual listening to this, as well as those who are going to impart on their lives some of the things that we've kind of discussed. And of course, that's all true. Now, from a systems-based perspective, so how to kind of enact change within massive scale systems, what we need is you'd have to have a catalyst. So you'd have to get one of us to go out there into the world, create some kind of hierarchy where they are on top of that hierarchy, and then create games within that hierarchical structure to value these propositions that we've created, like critical thinking and also being able to solve problems. I'll give you a perfect example of critical thinking, right? So from the beginning of this pandemic, myself and a couple other people made certain predictions about this pandemic and how it's going to ensue. I looked at basic stats from worldometers.com on basically the kind of age group that it affected, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I did a quantitative analysis on which countries are going to be affected and to what extent. Now, I stated this, and I said, certain African countries probably shouldn't bother locking down their countries because they're going to suffer from other aspects such as hunger and inability to actually feed and treat their citizens of other diseases far more than this particular disease, because it wasn't affecting them in the same rate, to the same extent, in the same sort of manner as it was affecting the rest of us in the West. And now the problem is, as you can see with a lot of these leaders within these so-called countries, none of them had that kind of vision to kind of see this. They were simply following suit onto what the rest of the world was doing, rather than being open to that critical thinking mindset. And actually, apart from one country, Tanzania, actually, they never had a lockdown. etc. And to this day, they really didn't have one. Now, it turned out that East Africa really didn't have much cases relative to every other country in the world. And the so-called leader of that one country, he is an engineer. Maybe that's accidental, who knows? But he was able to. Now, what he did is he created a narrative saying that God is protecting that country from this disease. Right. So what he did is he created a narrative. Now, obviously, knowing him and knowing his background, I could see that he didn't necessarily believe in that narrative. The narrative, because what he did is he actually sent off samples of the so-called virus from different fruits, not even people, fruits, to the World Health Organization, and they came back positive. So he did a scientific study to realize that there was some misreportings, and then he used that with this analysis of the data to actually predict how this thing was going to happen. So in the end, what happened is he was able to prevent his citizens from suffering from other aspects, depression, loss of job, and hunger and thirst, because he was able to analyze things in real time. And what he did to kind of hide this was the so-called narrative. He bought into a narrative that already existed, that the country believed in God, and actually now, and he knew that this narrative would be actually protected because he could analyze this fact that this was never going to be a problem. So now he's not only has he so-called be seen as a savior by his people, but now the next time he says anything else, they're going to believe him because they now believe he's touched by God. So the point I'm trying to make here is that's the kind of thing that some of us listening to this discussion should do. Create a hierarchy where you're the top of it, buy into an already existing system that already is there, that people are already slaves to, and then use that system with your own analysis that's parallel. So you create a system whereby your needs or goals are parallel to the beliefs of the people there, and then you can actually push forward that narrative there, and you can actually help them. Now, the next stage is teaching them to also think like you, which then you do by education, changing the education systems and creating these hierarchical games.
Whew. I think that was excellent. Yeah, speaking of Machiavellian, right? That was a good way of putting it. And then you add, and you're also helping them, which I always smile at. I'm like, really? Okay, maybe I want to help them. Maybe, who knows? But thank you very much, Kaizo, and thank you very much, Audra, Kaizo's intelligent friend, ladies and gentlemen. And this was a conversation, and I will go ahead and back you guys out right now. And it was a pleasure, always a pleasure, Kaizo. And perhaps we will tackle that consciousness knot at some point and talk about get down into some metaphysics, to whether we believe it is actually a fruitful conversation to have, metaphysics that is, or not. But we can have some musings on that in that regard. And ladies and gentlemen, this has been a third installation of our downtown Los Angeles. See that? See that intersection right there? Yeah. Downtown LA, and we started at sunset, and we watched the beautiful sunset on this very first day of 2021. Also, coincidentally, the first day of monetization on this. And a lot of you guys went ahead and shout out to K Coach, and he was the first. Okay. Shout out to K Coach. And then SOBC hit up the super chat. Okay. Super chat is now available. And one more time, I would have to thank you guys. You guys are the subscribers. You are the watchers. And you get monetized for subscriptions and hours watched. So this was all you're doing, 100% you're doing. And to the theme, to what we're talking about being able to spread critical thinking and also being able to create hierarchies where certain kinds of, let's say, as Kaiser would say, games, okay, have many games with many different hierarchies. Perhaps one where intellectual discourse in general is appreciated and supported. Okay, intellectual discourse of all kinds. And today's intellectual discourse was talking about the fact that we live in Storyville, ladies and gentlemen. We live in Storyville. We do not live in a world of objects that we understand by looking at these objects empirically and putting together some kind of logical arrangement of facts and coming up with what is. No, we all embedded into a story. How do we know how to behave? We put it in a story. What would Jesus do, right? How do we know who we are? Well, we are a story. That one most clearly is, without a doubt, true. We just are a story, a chronology, participating also in the story of the tribe, the family, the nation, okay? All the way through to the God story. Now, to finish off, I'm going to put my 2 cents into the last question that was asked to the guests regarding practical things to be gleaned from this. And I will put a nice little abstraction on what they've all said. They put down a few nice buckets. I would say that on this one hand here is the fact that perception precedes control. Okay? You need to be able to perceive clearly where you are at, understand what a handle is, right? Understand where a place is where you can put in your hand and manipulate, put in your hand and control, or, as Audra said earlier, certain pitfalls and deep ends you want to stay out of. Okay? In other words, you want to understand the landscape so that you can control. Perception precedes control. Basically, perceiving correctly that we live our lives in Storyville and not in some other place that you may have thought you lived in, right? That narratives upon narratives upon narratives is actually who you are and what runs the world. Understanding that allows you to have a certain level of control. Secondly, in all levels of influence and persuasion, and so on, and so on, and so on, you will be now able to, okay, you will be able to recognize quite clearly what the Storyville implications of the particular practice is. What do I mean by this? Let's say we're talking about sales and marketing. Okay, we're talking about sales and marketing. I've made videos before on selling and influencing, and I've talked about how you need to put a picture in the person's head. I've talked about how you're not selling a product, you're selling a story, that you constantly need to refer to the story, the painting of the future that you are trying to create for this person. And this is how you lure them into making this emotional decision, which is to buy. And that it is not some kind of a calculation thing where you give them arguments and then boom, you win, checkmate, now you must buy. No, that's not how it is. In other words, when you study marketing, sales, persuasion, public speaking, so on, so on, so on, politics, organizational psychology, whatever it may be, this whole landscape of people, and life is about people, and as people, our lives are indeed about story. So when you see, okay, some new form of abstract knowledge given to you in the realm of persuasion and so on and so forth, you can quickly notice the Storyville aspects of it. In other words, now you have a foundational set of understanding. So you understand the landscape of Storyville, starting with your particular story, the story of your family, all the way to the story of the nation. Understanding how we know things by embedding it in story, ethical knowledge embedded in story, knowledge of psychology embedded in story, so on and so forth. When you take this new practical knowledge given to you about marketing, sales, persuasion, influence, you can see the Storyville implications already. And this way you have a nice solid foundation upon which you can build. This, my friends, I would say, are the practical things to be gleaned from this. This was a formal introduction to Storyville. Storyville, however, has been used for all other aspects of our teachings, if you will, on this channel, our musings, our discussions. Okay. Even in my video that talked about being the most comfortable person in the room, okay, that was basically you getting in and understanding the stage, okay, understanding the stage that this drama was going to take place in, and thereby exuding and expressing a certain amount of mastery in that stage, and then you're able to tell people the story that you want to tell them, and on and on and on and on and on. Ladies and gentlemen, let me see before we go out if I can do something here. We got Majid podcast in the house saying good evening, dignified brothers and sisters. Big Mad Storyville hackers equals Donald Drapers. Exactly. We know about Mad Men, Madison Avenue, advertising and marketing. We know about the media landscape, the place where we curate stories, tell stories, keep up with the Joneses on Facebook, keep up with the Kardashians on some channel elsewhere. Okay. Almost $1 trillion industry in the United States. Okay. Manipulating stories, telling stories, so on and so forth. Okay. Shout out to Myth Twist in the house. Shout out to everyone in the house who's been holding it down. Okay, holding it down in the chat. Shout out to Audra and Kaizo again. And Nazarene Beats, whom apparently is Kaizo's brother. So the story goes. Shout out to Felicia in the house. And bye, Felicia.
Washing on the shore, relentless in the war. The legions in our hearts, shed waters in our balls. The spirit and the flesh, the emotions that arrest. The cerebral will contest, propelling the unrest. Preachers and bandits with means underhanded. The teachers pedantic and lack understanding. So sweep out the sand with the broom in your hand. Stand up, make we burn Babylon. Guess I can give the world to you, the world to you. But the falling of the curtain is for certain. Be careful where you lurking, demons searching. The spirit and the women fight the battle within. Cause I can give the world to you, the world to you. But the falling of the curtain is for certain. Be careful where you lurking, demons searching. The spirit and the women fight the battle within. With the semblance of a blaze, with gratitude and rage, we touch another page with delirious delight, impervious to light. This vitality and might encourages the flight. Preachers and bandits with means underhanded, the teachers pedantic and lack understanding. So sweep out the sand with the broom in your hand. Stand up, make we burn Babylon. Guess I can give the world to you, the world to you. But the falling of the curtain is for certain. Be careful where you're lurking, demons searching. The spirit and the women fight the battle within. Guess I can give the world to you, the world to you. But the falling of the curtain is for certain. Be careful where you're lurking, demons searching. The spirit and the women fight the battle within. The world to you, but the falling of the curtain is for certain. Be careful where you're lurking, demons searching. The spirit and the women fight the battle within. Cause I can give the world to you, the world to you. But the falling of the curtain is for certain. Be careful where you're lurking, demons searching. The spirit and the women fight the battle within. in the den of iniquity. Vicinity no pretty, calamity fi hit we any moment. What's a pity? Tomorrow never certain. What dwells behind the curtain? The face of evil smirking with that shifty eyes averting. It's not a steady bubble that either pop or topple. Many will fall and stumble. Let the dozers gather rubble. From LA to Colorado, Guinea to Burkina Faso. Cannons could reach the towers and the troops will storm the castle. Hey, I say, run, run, come, make we get it. Because the peace that is bestowed upon the meek is overrated. So run, run, come, make we get it. Calling all your daughters and your sons, we come forget it. I say, run, run, come, make we get it. Because the peace that is bestowed upon the meek is overrated. Lord, run, run, come, make we get it. Calling all your daughters and your sons, we come forget it. With the rubble steady rising, and hearts are compromising. Convictions here are stifling, making evil appetizing. The fists are steady forming, and countenance is falling. Defenses are withdrawing, possibilities are falling. In these your circumstances, evil will make advances. Pick up your sword and lances, and be sure to take your stances. Victory is never promised, the battle is upon us. Gather the brave and honest, and the righteous in your corners. Go. Run, 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 make we get it. Because the peace that is bestowed upon the meek is overrated. So run, run, come, make we get it. Calling out your daughters and your sons, we come forget it. I say, run, run, come, make we get it. Because the peace that is bestowed upon the meek is overrated. Lord, run, come, make we get it. Calling out your daughters and your sons, we come forget it. Because the peace that is bestowed upon the meek is overrated. So run, run, come, make we get it. Calling out your daughters and your sons, we come forget it. I say, run, run, come, make we get it. Because the peace that is bestowed upon the meek is overrated. Lord, run, come, make we get it. Calling out your daughters and your sons, we come forget it. Run for the hills, let the will lead the mind. For living is the thrill with the doubt left behind. Amidst all the wreckage, there is beauty to behold. We are fearless and intrepid from the depths of our soul. The hands of the steady cleave the rose from the thorn. The sweat of the weary brings us close to the dawn. The motion of the wheel brings the light to the mind. And in the line, it's divine. Run, run, come, make we get it. Because the peace that is bestowed upon the meek is overrated. So run, run, come, make we get it. Calling on your daughters and your sons.
All right. Okay. So I'm looking at the chat and there are questions about the music. Okay. So I definitely will be releasing these 2 tracks this year along with the rest of the new album. Okay. And you can go ahead definitely and check out the old album by searching We Are Soul Rising, all one word. That's SOLRISING. SOLRISING, ladies and gentlemen. So I cut the song short. So maybe okay, let me give you a verse and a hook live a cappella. Okay, that was Run, right? Yeah, that was Run. So let's go. Okay, so I see Nazarene Beats. Yes, you are leaving that over there. Okay, your Gmail. Okay, let me go ahead and sheepishly copy it while I try to make this situation work here. All right. In the den of iniquity, vicinity no pretty, calamity fi hit we any moment, what a pity. Tomorrow never certain, what dwells behind the curtain, the face of evil smirking with the shifty eyes averting. It's not a steady bubble, could either pop or topple. Many will fall and stumble, let the dozers gather rubble. From LA to Colorado, Guinea to Burkina Faso, cannons who breach the towers and the troops who storm the castle. Hey, run, run, come, make we get it. Because the peace that is bestowed upon the meek is overrated. So run, run, come, make we get it. Calling all your daughters and your sons, we come forget it. I say, run, run, come, make we get it. Because the peace that is bestowed upon the meek is overrated, Lord. Run, come, make we get it. Calling all your daughters and your sons. We come forget it.